The kidnapper's scary plan. Lily was on her way home from her best friend Emma's house. Emma's house was on a hill, and despite Emma urging Lily to stay over, she decided to head home. It was only 7:30 p.m., and she decided to take the bus. At the nearby bus stop, she arrived and saw a man already sitting there. He looked a bit strange, appearing to be homeless. The man's unsettling presence made Lily uncomfortable. She decided to keep her distance and stood there with a serious expression. Emma called her to ask if she had boarded the bus yet. Lily talked to her for a while, trying to ease the discomfort caused by the man's presence. Despite trying to ignore him, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that the man was watching her. Every 5 to 10 seconds, he would take out his phone and appear busy texting. After ending the call, Lily glanced at her phone. It was 7:45 p.m., and her battery was down to 10%. She sighed, annoyed that she hadn't charged it earlier. She stared at the long, empty highway, but there was no sign of the bus. She felt uneasy being alone with the strange man. Then the man stood up from his seat and started walking toward Lily. She looked away, trying to focus on her phone screen as he approached her.
Hey, got a lighter?
Without looking up, Lily curtly replied.
I don't smoke.
She could hear him moving behind her, but didn't dare to turn around. A moment later, she turned around, and he was standing right in front of her. His eyes stared at her vacantly, and his smile was eerie, grotesque.
Are you sure? All girls pretend they don't like attention, but they all love it.
Leave me alone.
She yelled loudly, threatening that if he didn't back off, she would scream and call the police, warning him that her friend's house was nearby and her friend's dad owned a gun. His smile vanished, and she thought she was safe. Then headlights appeared as a car pulled up, driven by an older woman who offered Lily a ride. Surprised but not hesitating, Lily seized the chance to escape the unsettling situation. She quickly got into the car without a second thought, leaving the man behind. As the car drove away, Lily saw the man smiling in the rearview mirror, and his expression sent chills down her spine. They drove off, and the woman smiled as Lily thanked her. But her friendly demeanor seemed odd when she turned to Lily and said,
Women need to be careful these days. You never know when you'll walk into a trap.
The woman drove slowly along the dark highway. After a while, they stopped at a deserted gas station parking lot. Lily watched the woman step out and shut the car door behind her. Lily wanted to call her parents to let them know, but she remembered her phone was dead. Just then, a ringtone sounded, and her eyes fell on a phone lying casually on the dashboard. She thought the woman must have forgotten it. She cautiously reached out to grab it. The phone unlocked without needing a password. At that moment, a wave of dread washed over her. The phone's wallpaper flashed on the screen, showing a picture of the woman standing next to a man. He was the same man Lily had seen at the bus stop. Somehow, they were connected. Panicked, she quickly grabbed the phone and slipped out of the car, but not fast enough. The woman returned, her kind expression gone, blocking the door.
Where do you think you're going, girl?
Lily stumbled, slipping through the driver's side door to get out. As she escaped, the woman circled around the back of the car, brandishing a knife to block her path. The woman lunged at her, and instinctively, Lily raised her arm to shield herself, causing the blade to slice painfully across her skin. Lily turned to run, but the woman grabbed her hair and yanked her back. Lily screamed, twisting and clawing at her hand. Blood dripped down her arm, her strength fading from the injury. But then, a surge of survival instinct kicked in. Lily stomped and kicked at the woman's shin, making her stumble and giving Lily a brief chance to escape. As Lily sprinted toward the road, headlights appeared in the distance. It was a truck. Desperate, she waved frantically, hoping they would stop. The truck slowed down as they saw her. The woman stood just behind her and yelled,
She's stealing from me. Stop her.
A man stepped out. Lily could only cry out.
She's lying. She tried to kidnap me.
He hesitated, but the sight of Lily's bleeding arm seemed to convince him. She quickly got into his truck, and they headed to the police station. Luckily, she had evidence, her phone. It was a treasure trove of proof. They were kidnappers preying on women and children. They had a twisted scheme. The man would harass women, and the woman would pretend to be a savior. Once inside the car, the victim had no escape. Luckily, Lily avoided becoming their next victim. Months later, she still thought about that night. Since then, Lily had bought a car and vowed never to take public transportation alone at night again. The eccentric person on the bus. The cold and quiet night in a small town. Bella often took the bus to get to her workplace. Every day, Bella waited at the same bus stop, quietly watching the world pass by while sipping her coffee. One evening, as usual, she waited for the bus to return home. But there was a man who caught her attention, sending a slight chill down her spine. A man in his 30s, disheveled hair, unshaven, boarded the bus after her. He sat a few rows behind her, but she could feel his eyes on her, though she didn't dare turn around. There was something strange about his presence. Every day on the bus, that man reappeared, always boarding right after her, and his strange behavior began. At first, he walked by and left behind a crude and eerie doll, saying, "This is for you," a gift, before quickly walking away. Bella found it odd and didn't pick it up, ignoring it and moving to another spot out of fear. Sometimes, he would mumble to himself in faint, incomprehensible whispers. Bella grew increasingly uncomfortable, but brushed it off, chalking it up to just an eccentric man. After all, he was just another bus passenger. As days passed without seeing him, she began to feel relieved, thinking she might have overreacted. One evening, Bella sat in her usual spot near the back of the bus. As the bus passed a stop, she saw a familiar figure. She froze, unable to believe her eyes. Then he boarded the bus. She avoided looking at him, pretending not to notice. She sighed in relief as he walked past, but her relief didn't last long as he doubled back and sat right next to her, despite plenty of empty seats around. She didn't dare move. He didn't look directly at Bella, but occasionally glanced at her from the corner of his eye. Then, suddenly, he turned his head toward her, locking eyes with her for a brief moment. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and hollow, sending chills down Bella's spine. At the next stop, he said nothing, simply placed a small piece of paper in her hand and got off the bus immediately, leaving her stunned. Throughout the ride, I didn't dare to open it. When I finally did, curiosity got the better of me. The note read, "I will follow you." Bella's heart raced as she hastily got off the bus. Bella hurriedly stepped off the bus and started walking faster, but then she heard footsteps behind her. When she turned around, no one was there. As soon as she entered her room, she locked all the doors and pulled the curtains tight, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. But then, from the window, she saw his figure lurking at the edge of the road, watching her. She couldn't tell if it was real or just her imagination driven by fear. The next day, Bella took a different route to work, avoiding buses entirely. But paranoia crept in. She began to feel like someone resembling the man from the bus was watching her from alleys, observing her from afar. Then the nightmare struck. A cold hand grabbed her wrist. Startled, she turned around in shock to see him. the man who had been following her from the bus. He gripped her tightly and said in a chilling voice, "You don't need to be scared. I just want to make sure you're safe." Bella was too terrified to think, only desperate to escape. She screamed, "Let me go," but it didn't change anything. His eyes were locked onto hers, unblinking. Luckily, Bella had prepared for the worst. She pulled a can of pepper spray from her pocket and sprayed it into his face, leaving him writhing in pain and temporarily blinded. Terrified, she ran without looking back and collapsed at a small roadside diner nearby, seeking help. He was apprehended shortly after being reported. He confessed that his obsession with Bella stemmed from her uncanny resemblance to his late girlfriend, who had died in a bus accident he couldn't prevent. He was diagnosed with PTSD, and seeing Bella on the bus had triggered his obsession. The man was later admitted to a facility for treatment. Bella, though still haunted by the events, found solace in knowing that the man wasn't truly a threat, but a broken soul lost in his past. But after all, everything had finally come to an end. The curse of the doll. The sun was setting as Claw walked home alone. Suddenly, an elderly woman appeared, dressed in tattered clothes, approaching her. The woman approached Clara, extending her hand which held an old, creepy-looking doll. What was strange was that the doll's head was tilted at an odd, unnatural angle, with a deep crack running down its body. At first, Clara intended to walk past, but something compelled her to stop. She gave the woman a few coins, and the doll was pressed into her hands before the woman left immediately. Clara returned to her apartment, the doll in her hands. She felt a shiver run down her spine, but dismissed it as just the chill of the night air. As she unlocked the door and stepped inside, she was completely unaware of the faint, soft footsteps following her. Claw held the doll up. Its lifeless eyes stared blankly, as if looking right through her. An uneasy feeling washed over her as she grasped its broken body and placed it on a high shelf before turning away. That night, Claw lay in bed. She tried to sleep, slowly turning onto her side. And right there, beside her pillow, was the doll, its broken neck tilted to one side. Its eyes stared hauntingly at her. She snatched it up and tossed it aside. The next morning, before heading to work, Claw paid little mind to it. She picked it up, glanced at it for a moment, then temporarily set the doll on the sofa. However, when she returned that evening, she found the doll in an odd position. Unexplainably, it was sitting on her bed in her bedroom, even though Claw had closed the door beforehand. She was certain she had left it in the living room. Claw furrowed her brow, glancing around her apartment, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. But soon after, she began to notice that her doll seemed to be moving around the room. In the following days, these occurrences seemed to persist. She began to see sticky notes scattered throughout their apartment, with phrases like "hello" and "it's broken." These notes were written on leather paper, something they didn't even have in the house. One afternoon, while alone in the apartment, Claw heard a faint rustling sound, as if someone was moving inside. She froze, straining to listen. After a moment, she began searching the rooms but found no one. However, on the bedroom floor, she saw the doll lying face down, its neck broken at an odd angle. A sharp pain shot through her chest, and she glanced at her hand, horrified to see bloodied scratches. The streaks of blood ran down her palm, though she had no idea how they got there. She stared at the doll, feeling as though its lifeless eyes were mocking her. What she couldn't understand was that within 2 days, the scratches vanished as if they had never existed. That night, Clara lay in bed, nervous. She tried to close her eyes, but a faint whisper echoed throughout the room, growing louder and louder until she could clearly hear the words, "It's over." Suddenly, a pressure bore down on her, and her eyes flew open to find the doll just centimeters from her face. Its eyes locked onto hers. Claw gasped for breath. She sat up, but the doll had vanished. It remained on the shelf as if it had never moved. Days passed, and Claw became increasingly withdrawn, her face pale, eyes dim. The presence of the doll seemed to grow, draining her energy. In a final frenzy, Claw found a metal bin in a nearby alley and threw the doll into the fire. The fabric doll burned, and Claw looked away, believing it was all over, and went home. But when she returned, the doll, singed but seemingly unharmed, sat inexplicably in her room. She felt powerless and exhausted. She picked it up. Suddenly, she collapsed to the floor, a strange sensation washing over Claw, as if her soul was being pulled from her body, drained by the doll. The next morning, an old woman stood in an alley. In her hands, she tightly clutched the tilted doll. People passed by, avoiding looking, instinctively feeling uneasy before her presence. Then there was a girl whose expression was more curious than scared. Her eyes stared at the doll, a curious excitement flashing in her gaze. She walked over and held out the doll. "You seem to like it, don't you?" She held out her hand, almost reaching for it before she pushed it away like she always did. She was excited to have it. Letting go, she watched contentedly as her new victim clutched the doll. Seemingly unaware of the curse, she was welcoming. As the young girl turned away, the old woman's eyes followed her. That's right. She was born to do this. Home alone and an uninvited guest. George lived alone in her house in a small Michigan town on weekends. She often came here to escape the urban lifestyle she had grown up in and had grown tired of. She enjoyed the peaceful countryside, but George's house was like something out of a horror movie, an old house with overgrown grass and peeling paint. One Friday, George had just arrived home. She sat on the couch, her eyes glued to the TV, relaxing after a long week at work. As she flipped through channels, her peace was suddenly interrupted by a knock at the door. At first, George ignored it, thinking it wasn't important. But the knocking grew louder and more persistent. George opened the door and saw a man standing there, holding a clipboard. She immediately assumed he was selling something. He asked her if she was satisfied with her security system. George replied that she didn't have one, but wasn't too concerned, joking that no one would break into such an ugly house. He then went on to describe all the recent break-ins in the area, which, honestly, George had never heard of. He then asked who George lived with, and she accidentally blurted out that she lived alone. Although she wasn't interested, he persistently asked for her phone number at least. He said he'd follow up in a few weeks, and even offered free installation on the spot. After some back and forth, George agreed since it sounded like a good deal. He thanked her and left. Later, George went to the kitchen to start cooking dinner, and then continued watching movies in the living room. She binge-watched for hours on the couch until around 11 p.m., when there was a knock at the door. This time, it was hard to ignore. George glanced at the clock, worried. 11 p.m. was far too late for anyone to knock on the door, especially since she wasn't close with her neighbors. The knocking persisted. She cautiously approached the door and asked who was there, but there was no response. Thinking quickly, she lied that she had a gun, though she didn't. She hoped it would scare them off. For a moment, the knocking stopped, but then her phone rang. When she answered, the voice on the other end claimed to be from 911, saying there was a dangerous intruder in her house, and they needed to come in to handle him. They said they were standing at her door, but she was skeptical. George looked around and saw nothing unusual. Meanwhile, the knocking outside continued relentlessly. She unlocked one of the latches, and hesitantly placed her hand on the doorknob. But before she could react, the door somehow opened. It wasn't a police officer like the caller claimed. It was him, the delivery man from earlier. His demeanor was erratic and strange, his eyes wide, no longer resembling a salesperson. Then he said,
"You shouldn't let yourself be tricked like that. Your house really is run down, but to let your guard down like this? I think you need me."
He smiled cheerfully, as if nothing had happened before. George had no idea what the hell was going on. He started telling her that his car had broken down, and he asked for a cup of hot water, saying he'd leave right after. But his expression was off. It was bad enough that she really thought he might be a burglar. Reluctantly, she went to get the water while he sat waiting in the living room. After finishing the water, he left, thanking her for the drink. She sighed in relief and moved to close the door. But as she tried to close it, his arm blocked it. A strong shove flung the door back open. She asked,
Did you forget something? Don't joke like that.
but no, he was slowly advancing, grinning maliciously. Instinctively, George backed away and ran into the kitchen. He chased her into the kitchen, laughing gleefully.
"You should have been more careful. Watching you scared is so entertaining."
Then he immediately went to the knife rack and grabbed one. He swung it through the air, narrowly missing, but it grazed her sleeve, leaving George injured and in pain. Panicked, unsure of what he wanted, she ran to the front door. But when she got there, George tripped and fell while he stood over her, knife in hand. Then her eyes caught sight of a mini fire extinguisher near the door. She grabbed it and sprayed it into his face, disorienting him. She grabbed the keys hanging nearby, ran outside, got into her car, and sped off in terror. Once she reached a safe distance, she called the real police to track him down. He was eventually apprehended, and it turned out the man wasn't a random intruder, but someone who had been stalking her. He had faked the 911 call, knowing she would open the door. That night would stay with her forever, but she remained grateful to be alive. George swore to herself that no one would ever trick her into opening the door again. Nightmare with the delivery person. I am one of those people who hates ordering food over the phone. My kids always criticize me and call me old-fashioned because rain, thunder, or snow, whenever we order food, I always drive straight to the restaurant. What they don't know is that this isn't just a whim. It's a story that's not exactly a pleasant one. I was 12 years old, and it was one of the first times I was allowed to stay home alone. My parents had gone to a friend's party a few blocks away and decided I was old enough to take care of myself. I was thrilled because I could stay home alone and sleep whenever I wanted. That night, I was allowed to order a pizza by myself. At first, my parents waited for the delivery guy, but he was taking too long, so they had to leave. Seeing how excited I was, they left me some money and headed out. As soon as they left, I turned on the TV and cranked up the volume. I knew it would be a long night, so I took the dog out to the backyard. After my parents left, he finally arrived, very late. I heard the sound of a motorcycle stopping outside my house. I stood up and walked toward the door. Maybe the pizza guy had finally arrived. I opened the door and saw a tall, skinny man with a scruffy, bushy beard holding a pizza box. He looked at me with a strange, almost unsettling expression. At that moment, I was hungry and feeling a little uneasy, so I said,
You're late.
The man stared at me and said,
Hey kid, what's your problem?
I started to feel weird about his behavior. He seemed almost angry, and his body language became more aggressive. At that moment, I got scared and just wanted to avoid anything bad happening. I quickly handed him the money and grabbed the pizza box from his hands. I apologized and quickly closed the door. I was so scared I nearly slammed it shut. But it didn't stop there. Things got worse. He didn't leave but stood there, almost shouting through the front door.
Hey kid, what are you doing? I haven't even counted the money.
All the money is there.
I cried and apologized. At that point, I just begged him to leave and take all the money. There was silence for a moment, but then the man started yelling again, demanding a tip. He lost control, banging on the door with his fists and kicking it when I didn't respond. After a few seconds, just as suddenly as it started, he seemed to get bored and left. My first instinct was to slowly creep toward the door and peek out the nearby window to check if he was really gone. But as I did so, his face suddenly appeared right in front of me, twisted into a crooked smile, and in his hand, he was holding something. When I realized he was holding a baseball bat, I panicked, frantically hiding under the bed, hoping he wouldn't find me. Meanwhile, he pounded on the door with the baseball bat, and after a few strikes at the lock, the door burst open and he entered my house. He went straight to the wardrobe, where I almost hid, and began smashing it violently. If I had hidden there, my entire body would have been destroyed. He left the room and headed straight for the backyard, suspecting I might escape there. My dog immediately attacked him, but at that moment, I heard my dog whimper. I realized something had happened to him, and I couldn't hold back the overwhelming sadness. He moved like a shadow, storming toward where I was hiding, his face twisted in anger.
Where are you, kid? I know you're hiding somewhere.
He yanked the mattress away and began smashing the bed with the bat, as if trying to break the wood and leave me trapped beneath the wreckage. The wood of the bed began to splinter, and the shards dug into my skin. All I could do was scream for help. As if answering my prayers, two of my neighbors burst in from behind and tackled him to the floor. He quickly got back up, grabbing the bat and trying to swing at them, but one of the neighbors managed to wrestle it away. Then he fled immediately. Suddenly, everything went white and I passed out. When I woke up, I found myself in the hospital. My parents were crying in front of me, saying I was lucky to have only minor injuries. I accidentally overheard my parents talking about the man. He had been a convict with a history of violence, and that night, he had fought with a couple and argued with his boss. In the years that followed, I never ordered delivery again after what happened. Home alone with a strange stalker. The house sat quietly in the suburban neighborhood, dark and isolated. The rain pattered against the windows, with occasional flashes of lightning hinting at an approaching storm, making everything feel more ominous than usual. Eva was watching a horror movie in the living room. Yet, every now and then, she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder, a part of her always feeling like something might be lurking behind her. After the movie ended, she went about her nightly routine, brushing her teeth, turning off the lights, and heading to bed. However, her peaceful sleep was interrupted around 1 a.m. when she heard a voice downstairs, calling her name. At first, she wasn't sure what was happening. The voice sounded oddly like her sister's, but Eva couldn't be certain, especially since her sister rarely came home. She got out of bed and walked down the hallway. The house was pitch black, the thick silence broken only by the sound of her footsteps. She entered the kitchen. The lights flickered, and Eva saw something. A knife lying on the kitchen floor, one she distinctly remembered cleaning and putting away earlier. She looked around, but no one was there. A few days later, she still hadn't shaken off the feeling. Eva tried to relax by watching TV, and at some point, she fell asleep there. While asleep, she heard a faint rustling noise. It seemed to be coming from the kitchen. A light flickered near the refrigerator. She cautiously approached. The scene sent chills down her spine.
Lily?
She softly called, but there was no response. She moved closer. Her sister appeared to be sitting with her back to the refrigerator, eating something in an almost frantic manner. Something about the way she was eating felt off. She wasn't sure it was really her sister. Exhausted, Eva chuckled to herself, thinking perhaps her sister was just really hungry. Trying to steady her trembling hands, she dismissed the thought, assuming it was her sister, and went back to her room, too tired to care. The next morning, before heading to school, Eva saw her sister. Eva asked her about the strange encounter.
Were you okay last night, Lily? Why were you home so late?
Lily looked surprised and confused, unsure of what Eva was talking about. She told Eva that she had worked the night shift and hadn't come home last night. Lily assumed Eva must have been sleepwalking. Eva froze. The woman she saw eating frantically in the kitchen wasn't her sister. But then, who was it? As usual, Eva finished dinner and began tidying up in the kitchen. Suddenly, the lights went out without warning. She stumbled in the darkness, trying to locate the light switch. As her hand reached out for the switch, she felt an icy presence standing behind her. A chill ran down her spine as she glimpsed a reflection in the refrigerator door. It was a figure resembling her sister, grinning unnaturally wide. She thought it must be a hallucination, a trick of her mind. That night, Eva struggled to sleep, tossing and turning in bed. Eventually, she dozed off, but was abruptly awakened by the sensation of the bed shifting beside her. Her eyes flew open in shock. She turned and froze. It wasn't a woman, but a man with a beard sitting on her bed. His lifeless eyes bore into hers as he spoke in a calm, haunting voice.
Eva, my sister.
Eva screamed and bolted from the bed. The man disguised as her sister chased after her, laughing slyly. She ran, desperate to escape. At the door, she fumbled with the handle in panic. Just as she managed to open it, he, still in his disguise, grabbed her arm and laughed triumphantly. Eva struggled, grabbing a lampstand from a nearby shelf and smashing it against his face. She fought her way free and sprinted to a neighbor's house for help. The neighbor helped her call the police, but when they arrived to take him away, he was sitting curled up in fear, then laughing inexplicably in Eva's room. The man, once in custody, confessed that he had been stalking her for a long time, hiding in the shadows. His trauma stemmed from a history of abuse. He had a compulsion to impersonate the people he encountered, believing he was becoming those he wanted to harm, including pretending to be Eva's sister. Eva and her sister finally found peace after the man was arrested, though the experience left emotional scars they could never forget. They comforted each other, knowing the nightmare was finally over. The ghost train on Christmas Day. It was Christmas Eve, and I was late for my flight. The snow was falling heavier than usual, and the slippery roads turned my usual route to the airport into a nightmare. I had to catch the last train out of town to make it to my flight. Otherwise, I'd be stuck until morning. I arrived at the station just in time to catch the train, which seemed unusually empty for such a busy night. It was an old model, not the kind of train I usually saw at this station. But I didn't have time to think about it. I hurried aboard. As I stepped onto the train, I noticed the conductor. He wasn't the usual friendly face I was accustomed to on my daily commutes. This man was older, gaunt, with tired eyes that made me uneasy. His uniform was dark and worn, as though it hadn't been cleaned in years. The inside of the train was just as strange, filled with the scent of old wood and something faintly musty lingering in the air. The train car was nearly empty, save for a few scattered passengers, but the atmosphere was tense, as if something wasn't quite right. I sat by the window, watching the snow fall heavier, blanketing everything outside. The train began to move, and I felt it sway slightly as it picked up speed out of the city. Then I heard the sound of a child crying, just a faint sob. At first, I thought I imagined it, but then it echoed faintly again, as if coming from somewhere near the back of the train. I tried to ignore it, but it echoed in my mind. I began to feel increasingly uneasy, glancing around again, but no one else seemed to notice the sound, which only made it worse. Then I saw him, the conductor. I asked him if he heard it. He said, "Not all passengers on this train want to be here, but they cannot leave." To my bewilderment, he walked away immediately. I steadied myself and turned to ask him about what he had just said. But strangely, he was no longer there. I stood up and walked toward the back of the train. My footsteps echoed in the silence. When I reached the next car, I froze in place. In the dim light, I could see a shadow. It was a child. He clutched a small, tattered doll in his hands, wearing what looked like outdated, shabby clothes. He didn't move, his head bowed. I asked, "Are you lost?" But there was no response. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the train lurched forward, shaking violently. Without thinking, I reached out to steady the boy. The lights stabilized, but the train car was empty, completely deserted. I moved back into the aisle, trying to understand what was happening. The other passengers remained still, staring straight ahead, oblivious to the madness unfolding around them. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand grasp my arm, sending a shiver through me. The train shook violently again, and the temperature plummeted. I could see my breath in the air. The train screeched to a sudden halt, and I stumbled, trying to steady myself. The passengers were gone. The train was empty, except for the boy, standing with his back to me. He didn't move, just stood there with his head slightly tilted, as if waiting for me to do something. The doll in the boy's hand fell to the floor. I slowly approached him, bending instinctively to pick it up. When I looked up, my breath caught in my throat. The boy turned, and his eyes were voids of pitch-black emptiness, locking onto mine. His voice echoed coldly in the air. "They left me." I panicked, never having seen anything like this before. Before I could react, the sound of crying turned into an ear-piercing scream, deafening and spine-chilling. I lost my balance and fell backward in fear, my vision spinning as the boy stood still, seemingly unaffected. The train doors suddenly slid open. With trembling hands, I crawled toward the exit, desperately trying to escape. I staggered out into the freezing, eerily silent night. But when I looked back, the train was gone, completely vanished, leaving only an empty, snow-covered platform as if it had never been there. I don't remember how I got home that night. Every Christmas Eve since, I still wonder whether the midnight train was real or just a nightmare. Years later, on another Christmas Eve, I found an old article, a newspaper archive about a train that disappeared in a snowstorm many years ago. The article spoke of a missing child whose parents had abandoned him on that very train. It was said that the Midnight Express appears every Christmas Eve, carrying lost souls who cannot move on. I closed my laptop, my hands trembling. I looked out the window. The snow continued to fall outside, and a chill ran down my spine. Pizza orders at the end of the day. If you've ever worked the late shift at a delivery restaurant, then you're probably familiar with occasionally receiving a last-minute order just before closing. That day, a man placed an order for a pizza. After entering the location into the GPS, I realized that the address was far and remote. I tried to mention the inconvenience of delivering it because it was quite far, but the guy on the phone just ignored me. As I entered the address into the GPS on my phone, I realized how remote it was, and I started regretting not hanging up when I had the chance. As I drove, the winding, unfamiliar roads led me deeper into the countryside, past an old abandoned blockbuster. I recalled my mother's warning never to go beyond that place, but I never knew why. Memories of missing children and locked doors from years ago flooded back, leaving me uneasy. The dirt roads became increasingly difficult to navigate. Finally, I arrived at the location, a rundown, abandoned house at the end of a muddy road. I felt a chill as I wondered if I had the right address, but the GPS confirmed that I had arrived. Leaving the pizza in the car, I approached the house to see if anyone was home. A note was taped to the door with instructions to deliver the pizza to a vehicle near the house. This struck me as odd. Why hadn't the customer mentioned this over the phone? And who asks for a pizza to be delivered to a vehicle? I was confused. Despite growing anxiety, I decided to follow the instructions since I had come this far. As I rounded the corner of the house, I was startled to see an old camper van parked with its back doors wide open. I slowly approached, hardly daring to breathe. I froze as I realized the figure was dragging something heavy, a rolled-up carpet, stained dark. The man finally moved, stepping forward into the dim light. His face remained hidden in the shadows by a wide-brimmed hat, but I could feel the cold and mysterious aura emanating from him. He extended a gloved hand toward me, but instead of reaching for the pizzas, he handed me an old, weathered envelope. I hesitated before taking it, sensing something unsettling. His voice was low and ominous as he told me to take the envelope to the house on the hill, a place I knew was infamous in local lore, said to be cursed. Before I could refuse, the man turned and walked back into the vehicle, disappearing into the darkness. I was left alone in the cold night, holding the envelope. I quickly turned and rushed back to my car, my heart pounding in my chest. I fumbled with the keys, desperate to start the engine and get away. I didn't dare open the envelope, fearing what might be inside. Instead, I threw it onto the passenger seat, started the engine, and drove off. As I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, praying no one was following me. Then suddenly, that vehicle began chasing me, with the faint sound of the radio echoing behind. In a moment of desperation, I decided to floor the gas pedal and head back to the old Blockbuster building, the only nearby place where I might find some cover. I pulled off the road and parked behind the building, killing the engine. I held my breath, praying I hadn't been seen. I waited until the music faded before I dared to breathe again. As I sat in the darkness, my phone finally died, plunging me into complete isolation. In the distance, I saw a figure. It was him, slowly approaching with that mysterious wide-brimmed hat. Panic began to overtake me. I fumbled to start the car, my hands trembling with fear. The engine roared to life just as the man reached the car, his hands slamming against the window. I slammed the gas pedal and sped away from there. I drove straight to the police station. When I arrived, I frantically explained what had happened, but the officers seemed skeptical. They told me that the house where I delivered the order had been abandoned for years and that the area was known for strange occurrences, but I knew what I had seen. Several weeks later, as I tried to move on with my life, I received a package in the mail. There was no return address. Inside was the same old envelope, and this time there was something inside, a small handwritten note that simply read, "We will meet again." The ghosts in the fog. Tonight, like every other night, I drove my truck down a desolate rural road, taking a sip of coffee to stay awake. The road stretched ahead, cloaked in a thick fog that clung to my headlights. The stillness was eerie. No cars, no animals, just the hum of my engine and the faint crackle of the radio. I considered stopping to wait, but decided to keep going. Moving felt safer than sitting in the dark. A faint smell wafted in, like something metallic. At first, I thought it was just the engine, but it grew stronger, sour and rotten, mingled with the scent of decaying bone. It was stifling, worse than anything I'd ever smelled. I rolled up the window, but the stench lingered, filling the truck like a living thing. My stomach churned violently, and I pulled over to the side of the road. I stumbled out of the truck, gasping for fresh air, but the stench clung to me, lingering in the air. Unable to bear it any longer, I began vomiting. Once I was done, I quickly covered my nose as the smell still hung thick in the air. As I straightened up, I noticed movement ahead, a figure limping across the road, slow and deliberate. The figure was a man. He wore a torn white shirt and black trousers, the fabric old and frayed. I froze, watching him cross the road, oblivious to the faint presence of my truck. His head was slightly bowed, his face obscured by the fog. I climbed back into the cab, intending to approach him. As I drove closer, my headlights illuminated the road ahead, revealing more figures emerging from the fog. All dressed in old-fashioned clothing, moved disjointedly. They limped in unison, heads bowed. They didn't seem to notice me or each other, moving toward the darkness on the other side of the road. I kept driving. Then, from the same direction, a smaller figure appeared, a child, maybe in their early teens. The dense fog surrounded him as he stood motionless on the road, head bowed. Uneasy, I thought the boy might need help. I stopped the truck and stepped out once more. I approached him. "Do you need help?" I called, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay calm. The boy didn't respond. Instead, his body remained unnaturally still, his head bowed like a puppet with its strings cut. A heavy silence blanketed the road. I swallowed hard and took another hesitant step forward. Suddenly, the boy's head snapped upward with a jerky motion, the crack of his neck loud enough to echo in the stillness. His face was pale and vacant. I stumbled backward as he tilted his head, as if studying me. Then an impossibly wide mouth opened, a gaping maw that hissed a single word.
"You won't escape!"
Before I could react, he lunged forward, his icy hands clamping around my leg like a vise. He tightened his grip further. I kicked desperately, trying to break free. Pain shot through me as my knee hit the road. I clawed at the ground, panic surging through me. With all my strength, I yanked my leg free and scrambled backward. My hands and knees burned from the sharp gravel, but I didn't care. All I could think about was escaping. The boy stood and started running toward me, his arms flailing and legs bent at unnatural angles. I stumbled toward the truck, with him right behind me. I dove into the cab and slammed the door shut, fumbling with the lock. His scream was deafening, shaking the truck's windows. His grotesque face, with its gaping mouth, pressed against the windshield. His hands slammed against the glass, leaving smears of something dark and viscous. Trembling, I turned the key and slammed my foot on the gas. The truck lurched forward, throwing him off the hood. His twisted body writhed as he stood back up. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing in the road, surrounded by other nameless figures emerging from the fog. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the fog growing thicker. They stood motionless, watching as my truck sped into the darkness. The road stretched ahead through thick fog. I couldn't stop thinking about the faceless figures I'd seen before. Days had passed since I escaped the boy in the fog. Their hollow presence, the way they lunged toward me, it felt like they were still out there, just beyond the reach of my headlights, waiting for me. But I couldn't turn back. My delivery had to be made, and this was the only road. Then that smell hit me again faintly at first, metallic, but quickly turning into a stench, sharp and rancid, like rotting meat. My stomach twisted as I tried to breathe through my mouth, but it was no use. Ahead, my dim headlights illuminated an old sign by the roadside. It swayed lightly in the wind, its paint cracked and faded. Danger, though at the time, I had no idea of its significance. My headlights flickered briefly, catching the silhouette of a figure in the distance. I slowed the truck, squinting to see the figure more clearly. It was a man, limping across the road, his form distorted by the fog. I hesitated, unsure whether to stop. Then another figure appeared, and another. All of them moved in the same direction, heads bowed, their movements unnervingly stiff. I continued driving slowly, keeping my distance. The figures kept crossing, oblivious to my truck, disappearing into the fog on the other side. I gripped the wheel tighter. "Just people," I muttered, trying to calm myself. "Just people." Then my tires hit something wet and slippery, causing the truck to swerve. I slammed on the brakes, and then I saw it. A black, wet streak stretched across the asphalt. I stepped out of the truck, the freezing air biting at my skin. The stench hit me, a wave of nausea roiling my stomach. Ahead, the trail led to the carcass of an animal, its body decayed and rotting. Flies buzzed frantically around it, staining the road with wide, dark streaks. I was about to leave, but then something caught my attention farther down the road, shapes moving in the fog. A group of people stood by the roadside. Their movements were strange, unnatural. The next sound that reached me was growling, and perhaps chewing, as if they were gnawing on something. The fog thinned enough for me to see them clearly. I didn't know what they were, but they resembled the things I had seen before, only much more terrifying. Horrifying hollow cavities gaped on their faces and bodies, oozing a black, tar-like fluid. Some of them hunched over another animal carcass, gnawing on its remains with clawed, deformed hands. My gasping breath broke the silence. Then their movements suddenly slowed to a halt. For a moment, I froze, and the others followed suit, all raising their heads in unison. They were looking at me. Then they began running, charging toward me. Their bodies twisted and contorted, their growls morphing into frenzied screams. They were faster than I imagined. I stumbled, fumbling for my keys as I turned back toward the truck. The keys slipped from my hand and fell. I was only a few steps from the truck when something grabbed my leg. I fell hard, hitting the ground. One of them had grabbed my leg. My foot was slick with its slimy grip. In a moment of desperate panic, I twisted and kicked with all my strength to break free. I staggered to my feet and bolted for the truck. I slammed on the gas, speeding away from those grotesque creatures. I didn't stop. My hands ached. The road stretched ahead, silent. In the rearview mirror, all that remained was an empty highway. I swore I would never take that road again. I silently thanked whatever force had kept me alive. Weird night at school. I work the night shift as a janitor at a local school. This job is quite fitting for someone who enjoys solitude. Just me, the empty school, and my mop bucket. I only talk to my coworker when absolutely necessary. Most of the time, we divide the school and don't see each other during the entire shift. One night, the school was completely silent. The only sound was the occasional echo of my mop hitting the floor. I've done this 1,000 times, but something about this night felt different, as though something was watching me from the darkness. I brushed it off and kept cleaning. I put on headphones, playing music low enough to still hear if someone was around, but everything seemed normal. I took a break to change the water in my mop bucket. When I returned, I noticed something strange. The wet floor sign I had placed earlier had fallen over. I sighed and stepped forward to pick it up, but that's when I saw them. Small, wet footprints leading away from the sign and down the hallway. I followed the footprints, which led to the staircase heading up to the second floor. I stopped, trying to listen for any sound. Then, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. It was fast, a flicker of motion at the end of the hallway. I rushed to the end of the hallway, but no one was there. At that moment, I heard faint laughter, the giggling of a child. It echoed through the empty school, sending a chill down my spine. I turned, searching for the source, but saw no one. A loud crash suddenly broke the silence. The sound came from the first floor. My mop bucket had been tipped over, spilling water into a large puddle. My blood boiled with frustration. Someone was messing with me, and I wasn't in the mood for games. I grabbed a dry mop and started cleaning up. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched as I tried to figure out what was happening. Were there students still in the building? Had someone snuck in after hours? I decided to talk to my coworker. Maybe she had seen something too. She laughed and told me I was joking with her. She looked at me, completely puzzled, shaking her head. I've been here the whole time. I couldn't make sense of it. I left her workspace and went back to finish my shift. Another hour passed. I was trying to make up for lost time when, without warning, the entire school went dark. For a moment, I was surrounded by darkness. Then the emergency lights flickered on, bathing everything in a dim red glow. It felt like the entire building had turned into a horror movie set. I knew where the electrical room was, so I decided to head there. But before I could reach it, I heard a scream, my coworker's scream, echoing through the school, filled with terror. I ran toward the electrical room, fear welling up inside me. When I reached the door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. When I pushed the door open, I expected to see my coworker inside. Instead, there was a figure standing in the dark. I couldn't tell who it was, but something about it felt off. The figure moved closer. Before I could pull out my phone, it lunged forward and slammed the door shut in my face. Panicked, the first ran away. I needed to find my coworker. When I reached her area, her mop bucket was lying in the middle of the hallway, but she was nowhere to be found. I called out her name, but there was no response. The only sound was faint laughter, echoing again through the empty hallway. The whispers made me freeze. I turned quickly, gripping the mop handle tightly, ready to defend myself. I moved slowly and cautiously. Something was happening here, something I couldn't explain. I headed up to the second floor, where I had heard the laughter earlier. When I reached the hallway, I noticed something strange. The wet footprints, the same ones I had seen earlier, had returned. I stared at the small, damp prints, which seemed to be heading toward me. I ducked into the nearest classroom, slamming the door shut behind me. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath, my hands trembling. That's when I saw the blackboard. Scrawled in large, jagged letters were the words, "Hello." Had someone come in here? But I hadn't heard anyone enter. Suddenly, I heard the door rattling. Something was trying to get in. The handle twisted violently, shaking as though someone, or something, was pounding on it. I backed away, gripping the mop handle like a lifeline. The pounding on the door stopped. I slowly crept toward it and pressed my ear against it. But there was nothing. I reached for the doorknob, turning it as gently as possible. I cracked the door open slightly and peered into the hallway. I cautiously stepped out, scanning for any signs of movement. I had to find my coworker. I couldn't stay in this school alone any longer. As I walked down, from where I stood, I saw a shadow at the bottom of the stairs. It didn't move, just stood there, a dark figure faintly visible in the red light. As I got closer, I saw a young boy, maybe 13 or 14, standing with his back to me, wearing a tattered school uniform. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Hey, are you okay?" The child didn't respond. I took another step forward, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch his shoulder. Then the child turned around, a horrifying mask, pale and soulless eyes, blood dripping from his nose, and a wide, toothy grin aimed at me. The child let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the stairwell, a shrill, piercing sound that felt like it was ripping through my skull. I staggered backward, dropping the mop. I ran as fast as I could down the hallway. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out. The hallway seemed endlessly long in a horrifying way. I burst through the door into the gym. The gym was pitch black. I backed away from the door, my body trembling with fear. The footsteps stopped. The door remained shut. For a brief moment, I thought I was safe. But then, from the far corner of the gym, I heard it, a basketball bouncing. There, in the far corner, the child still stood, his face twisted into that eerie grin, holding a basketball and bouncing it slowly. Then the boy whispered, "Hello," his voice echoing through the empty gym. I stepped back, my legs trembling. The child took a step forward, then another. Each step was slow, deliberate, as though he was savoring the fear he was causing. I didn't think anymore. I bolted outside, running as fast as I could toward the parking lot. My legs felt like they would give out at any moment, but I kept running. I didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally unlocking the door and jumping inside. As I started the engine, I looked back at the school. In one of the second-floor windows, I saw the child standing there, staring down at me with that twisted smile. I hit the gas and sped out of the parking lot. The image of that child burned into my mind. I didn't return to the school the next night. I never went back there again. Echoes from the haunted shop. It all began as a challenge. Every town has one, a haunted location that no one dares to enter after dark. For their city, it was an old fast food restaurant that had closed down years ago after a string of mysterious deaths. Now, it stood there, decaying at the corner of the street. For years, stories surrounded the place. Customers disappeared, strange noises echoed at night, and lights flickered inside despite no power. Some even claimed the place was cursed. The building loomed before them, weeds sprouting through cracks in the sidewalk, and an old, rusty delivery truck sat in a distant corner. The neon sign had long since died, but somehow, even in its decay, it emitted an eerie glow under the moonlight. They approached the door, and James pushed it open without hesitation. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty space inside. A foul odor immediately assaulted their noses, a rotten mixture of mold and something much worse, something decaying. But as she stepped inside, Sarah felt a chill seep into her bones. Her eyes darted around, wide with anticipation. Inside, the scene was worse than expected. It looked frozen in time, as if everyone had left one day and never returned. Dust covered the wrapping counter and old trays lay scattered on the floor. Then, a flickering light appeared at the back, something that shouldn't have been on. As there was no power here, they moved toward the kitchen, where most of the rumors originated. They said a corpse had been found here. As they approached the kitchen door, the overhead light flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows on the wall. James gave a nervous smile. The kitchen was a mess. Rusty appliances were caked with grease. The tiled floor was cracked, and dark stains splattered the walls. They began to hear whispering growing louder, coming from the old cold storage room at the back of the kitchen. Sarah stepped closer and peered inside. Something caught her attention, a reflection. At the back of the cold storage room, behind the shelves, was a mirror. The strange thing was they had never seen a mirror inside a cold storage before. And in the reflection were the two of them. But there was another dark shadow standing right behind Sarah and James. She turned around abruptly, but the room was empty. But in the mirror, they could both see her. A woman. She stood just a few feet away, her sunken eyes and skeletal face staring at them hungrily. In fear, They turned to leave, but the cold storage door slammed shut with a deafening noise. Darkness seemed to engulf them. She didn't dare look back, feeling a chilling presence as if she were right there behind her. Sarah fumbled for her phone, desperately seeking light, and when she turned on the flashlight, everything only got worse. In the beam of light, Sarah saw her face. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. It was pale, eyes rolled back, emaciated, and her skin seemed to crack. Her bony fingers brushed against Sarah's skin. And then, suddenly, as quickly as it had started, she vanished. Before she could regain her composure, in the corner of the room, hidden among boxes and discarded trays, something caught Sarah's eye. She stopped, pointing with a trembling finger. It was a woman lying on the floor, her limbs twisted at unnatural angles. It was still decaying. She thought it couldn't be simple. Perhaps it was a murder. There was no time to think anymore. They hurriedly left the place. Sarah trembled. In a panic, she pulled out her phone to call 911. A while later, they arrived to cordon off and investigate the abandoned place. Then they heard an announcement from a detective. The woman they found matched the missing person they were searching for. Her family had reported her missing just 2 days prior. A chill ran down their spines as they heard his words. Realizing they had just encountered the victim of an unsolved case made the atmosphere feel heavy. Returning home, even now in the silence of the room, they sometimes heard whispers. They thought perhaps this wasn't a place to explore. There's always a reason why places like this have rumors, and they often stem from real dangers. The darkness from the Myers house. I used to work for DoorDash a few years ago, wandering through the maze of New York City at midnight to earn a few extra bucks. Tonight was no different, but it turned out to be my last delivery, a job that haunted me long after I left. GPS led me to an unfamiliar part of the city, dark and alien. My destination was an old, rundown fast food joint I'd never seen before. A man came out of the kitchen holding a package. It was red, like rotting meat, and I seriously doubted the hygiene and quality of their food. Handing me the package, the man said it was to be delivered to a place called the Myers house. The old man looked at me with hollow eyes and said to deliver it just before midnight, not to knock, just to leave it at the door. Confused, I asked if I should notify the customer. The man's face darkened. "You don't want to disturb Mrs. Myers. Trust me, it's for your own good and safety." His words lingered as I left. Something felt very wrong about this delivery, and I couldn't help but dwell on the strangeness of it all. In the drizzling rain, GPS led me down an abandoned road, miles away from any familiar part of the city. Soon, a shape emerged in the mist, the Myers house. The building loomed before me, old and decrepit, with boarded-up windows. I checked the address again. It matched. A dim light flickered on the porch, but there was no doorbell. I hesitated, then knocked on the heavy old door. The sound echoed in the silence, but there was no answer. I knocked again, harder, and the door creaked open just enough to reveal a face. A pale woman appeared in the gap. She whispered, "Didn't he tell you not to knock?" I stammered an apology, then made an excuse. It's so dark, and I didn't want to leave the food outside." She gave a strange smile, her bony fingers brushing against mine as she took the package. They were icy cold, the chill seeping into my bones. At that moment, a loud clap of thunder boomed outside, and rain began pouring down. I groaned at the thought of heading back out into the storm. She looked at me. "You can wait here. Perhaps a cup of tea while you warm yourself?" Exhausted and soaked, it being my last shift, I figured it wouldn't hurt. So, I stepped inside. I followed her inside, surprised by the stark contrast to the exterior. A large stone fireplace cast a warm glow across the luxurious living room. The woman introduced herself as Eleanor and offered me tea. I sat down, feeling a bit uneasy. She began offering me dessert, but I declined. Then her expression shifted. Eleanor's smile grew dark and menacing. Suddenly, something gleamed, a butcher knife in her hand. I froze, realizing the hunger burning in Eleanor's eyes. Panic overtook me. My head spun as I tried to stand, but my legs felt leaden, my movements sluggish. I could barely lift my arms. I forced myself to stand, reaching for anything I could use as a weapon. My hand closed around a brass candlestick. As Eleanor lunged, staggering, I swung with all the strength I had left. The candlestick connected with a sickening crack, sending her sprawling to the floor. Her bony fingers clawed at the carpet, dragging her broken body toward me, the hunger in her eyes burning brighter. Taking advantage of the brief respite, I staggered toward the front door, fumbling for the handle. With desperate strength, I yanked the door open. I didn't look back as I ran into the storm. I kept running until I saw and flagged down a passing car, collapsing onto the wet sidewalk. The last thing I saw was a stranger's worried face as I blacked out. I woke up in a hospital room and was told I had been drugged with sedatives. Even more shocking was that the restaurant where I had picked up Eleanor's order had vanished. It didn't exist on GPS. I can't help but think there are still hidden restaurants scattered across the city, secretly catering to the midnight cravings of cannibals I'll never understand. The stalker in the forest. The sun barely peeked through the dense pine trees as I drove north, my truck loaded with skiing gear and camping supplies. This time, my friend Leo and I had planned a skiing trip in a remote area, miles away from any ski resort. After a few hours of driving, I parked my truck at the base of an area that looked decent with several hills. But I stopped there because I really couldn't drive any further due to the trees. Leo and I unloaded our gear, struggling to walk a quarter-mile to a clearing where we set up camp. It was an incredible amount of work with all the stuff we had to carry. In a small clearing among the trees, we pitched the tent, laid out our sleeping bags, and organized our gear. After setting up camp, we began hiking up the hill, carrying our snowboards and keeping an eye on the steep slopes. The ascent was quite challenging, but I felt thrilled as we climbed higher. We snowboarded down several slopes, one after the other. But as I neared the bottom of a slope, I lost sight of Leo. I assumed we'd meet at the base or regroup at camp. It wasn't unusual for us to take different paths down the hill. I called him on the radio, but all I got was static. Maybe he was still skiing and had started down alone. My eyes scanned the trees for any sign of him. When I reached the base of the hill, I walked and spotted another figure emerging from the woods. A skier, wearing a mask and dressed in layers. He approached me, seeming friendly beneath the ski mask, asking where the best hills were and if we were camping. He explained that he and his wife were looking for a good place to camp near others and asked if I could lead him to my campsite, though I really didn't want to. I pulled out the radio again, calling Leo to let him know I would be heading back to camp soon. The device crackled, a distorted noise cutting in, but there was no response from him at all. Then the man started following me, his presence behind me making me feel uneasy. Suddenly, I started hearing static from the other end of the radio, as if someone was trying to talk to me but couldn't connect. When we finally reached the tent, something felt off. I realized I hadn't seen his wife, so I asked where she was. He didn't respond. Instead, he moved closer, his movements becoming increasingly strange. But for some reason, something about his snowboard and backpack caught my attention. They felt familiar. Gray, bright orange. The snowboards tightly strapped on either side. My mind raced as I remembered. Leo had the exact same ones. For a few seconds, I thought Leo was pranking me. But no, the voice was too different. He stepped within inches of me, revealing his real face and grinning maliciously. This was not Leo. Panic surged as I backed away, stumbling into the tent. I rifled through the backpack, my fingers fumbling for the flare gun. Just as I grasped it, the man grabbed my foot sticking out of the tent. Then I suddenly felt a sharp pain in my leg. A severe tingling sensation in my leg felt like a strong electric shock, burning, and I screamed in pain. I glanced down and saw a knife embedded deep in my thigh. A scream tore from me as I grabbed the flare gun. He stepped back, but I didn't lower the weapon. I aimed directly at him. Blood oozed from my wound, staining the snow beneath me. I demanded to know where my friend was. The man's voice was calm, almost mocking, as he told me Leo was lying near the foot of the slope where we had been skiing. His words sent chills down my spine. He turned and sauntered away, disappearing into the darkness of the woods before I could fire a shot. My vision blurred from the pain, but I pressed down on my leg, trying to staunch the bleeding while I grabbed my phone and called 911. Just as I began to lose hope, a distant noise reached my ears. A rescue helicopter illuminated the snow-covered hills. With the little strength I had left, I fired the flare gun, the red light bursting into the sky. I mustered all my strength to tell them about Leo. He was found lying motionless on the hillside, his face pale. Blood stained his pants and the snow beneath him. A few days later, we were both recovering in the hospital, our wounds stitched up, but the memories remained vivid. We learned that our attacker was wanted for multiple assaults in remote areas, always hunting those who wandered too far from safety. The woman disappeared in white clothes. I grew up hearing stories from my cousin, who worked at the local police station. He was the kind of person who had seen it all. But there's one story he told me that always sent chills down my spine, and it's true. This story is about the mysterious woman in white. It all started with a midnight call from a gas station attendant. My cousin's colleague, Officer Nathan, was working the night shift. The attendant claimed he had been robbed, and the thief fled before he called. A woman in a white dress with long black hair, incredibly beautiful. Strangely, the suspect wasn't a masked figure or some shady guy, but a woman. He explained that she had come to him, asking for help because she was lost in the middle of the night. He had gone to the office to notify his boss, but when they returned to the cash register, she was gone, and so was all the money. Nathan, the only officer on duty so late, immediately got in his patrol car and headed to the gas station. It was a deserted road, winding through the woods on the outskirts of town. As Nathan drove, his headlights caught movement up ahead. A dark shadow was slowly walking toward him. Walking alone in the opposite direction was a woman in a white dress. She matched the attendant's description exactly. He accidentally passed her by, but unsure if his eyes were deceiving him, he saw that she had no face as he drove by. Finding it too unbelievable, he slowed down and reversed to check if she was indeed the woman the gas station attendant had described. After reversing, he stopped and quickly stepped out of the car, saying, "You need to get in the car and come with me to the police station immediately." She said nothing and complied. On the drive back to the station, he asked her a few questions about why she had stolen the money. However, she didn't say a word. He looked through the rearview mirror as she sat in the back seat, staring intently at one spot until they arrived at the station. Her behavior was strange, so he thought the woman might have mental issues. After that, he decided not to ask her any more questions. When they got back to the station, they began interrogating her, but she still didn't speak. His shift was almost over, so he prepared to hand over the report to the incoming officers. Just before he was about to leave, she suddenly started talking. She gestured and spoke, promising to return the money the next day if they let her spend the night in the holding cell at the station. She kept insisting that she had nowhere to go, and the officers were quite confused by what she was saying, unsure of what to do. Nathan reported to his superiors. He was informed that they couldn't move her to another holding facility that day. So in the end, they agreed to her request and placed her in the holding cell. Before leaving, Nathan made a final call to the gas station, informing the attendant that they had caught the suspect. The money would be returned the next morning, or so they thought. The next morning, Nathan returned to the station. As he approached the woman's cell, he witnessed a horrifying scene. The cell was empty. The woman they had arrested the night before was gone, except for the crumpled body of a man, her cellmate. His face was shredded with deep scratches, his wide eyes frozen in terror, and his body was pinned to the wall with nails driven into the flesh. Scattered around him were bills, and a few banknotes that hadn't been found the day before were stuffed into his pockets. Worse still, scrawled in blood on the wall beside his body were the words, "I have paid the debt." Nathan frantically searched the area. Even more terrifying was that she had completely vanished. No one heard or saw anything. The cameras? They hadn't captured any footage of her entering or leaving the cell. She had disappeared without a trace. A thorough search was conducted. The surrounding area was combed, and every possible lead was followed. But the woman in white was never found. She simply vanished, like a ghost fading into the darkness. Even to this day, no one knows who or what she was, but the officers present that night remain haunted by the incident. That's the whole story my cousin told me. I sat and listened, and I could still see the fear in his eyes when he spoke about her. The question that always haunted me was how she managed to escape from the cell. Was she human, or something far worse? The strangest part is that she evaded all the surveillance cameras. After countless investigations, they still don't know what happened that night or where she went. Haunting on the midnight train, the town lay deep in the mountains, with old houses scattered about and streets filled with whispers of long-forgotten stories. One of those mysterious tales was about the midnight train. For many years, no one dared to board the train, but I was not like them. I was the kind of person who believed that fear was for those not seeking answers. On that cold winter night, I decided it was time to confront the truth myself. I arrived at the train station just before midnight. The platform was empty, the old wooden benches creaking under the weight of the cold wind. Flickering lights cast strange shadows. The ticket counter was manned by an elderly station master, his eyes glancing at me with a mix of concern and pity.
"Are you sure about this, son?"
I nodded, smiling confidently at him. "It's just a train ride. I'll be back." The station master sighed and handed me the ticket. I caught a glimpse of him muttering a small prayer as I walked toward the platform. The slow minutes dragged on as I waited. The air felt heavier than usual, as if the town was holding its breath. Then, in the distance, I heard the whistle of a train, its headlights slicing through the darkness like two eerie eyes. The train stopped before me, its peeling black paint and dirty, soulless windows. The door creaked open, inviting me inside. I hesitated for a moment, but then took a deep breath and stepped inside. The flickering lights cast long shadows across the old seats. The air was thick with dust and something else, something I couldn't quite identify. A feeling unnatural. As I walked down the aisle, I realized the train was empty. No passengers, no ticket collector, no signs of life. Strangely, I wasn't scared. Instead, I felt a thrill. I sat by the window, watching the small town fade away into the distance. At first, everything seemed fine. The train accelerated, speeding through the night, but after what felt like hours, I noticed something was off. The darkness outside the window was unusual, like a void. I glanced at the clock, only to see the hands frozen in place. A sense of unease washed over me. The light above me flickered violently before plunging the train into complete darkness. I held my breath. I fumbled for my phone, hoping to use it as a flashlight. But when I pressed the screen, it remained black, completely unresponsive. Panic set in. Suddenly, I heard it, a whisper.
Jacob.
My heart skipped a beat. I froze, trying to listen. The voice was faint, barely above a breath, but it was there.
Jacob, come to me.
I turned around, but the car was empty. The whispers grew louder, closer. I hurriedly stood up and stumbled, trying to find the ticket collector's car. When I reached the front, I found the car empty. Just an old, dusty uniform hanging on a hook. No one was there. The train shook violently, throwing me off balance. I clung to the seat to steady myself as the whole car seemed to tremble. The train was moving faster, dangerously fast. I reached for the control panel, hoping to stop the train, but it was covered in dust and cobwebs, as if it hadn't been used in years. My fingers fumbled over the switches, but nothing worked. Then the whispers returned, growing louder, filling the air around me.
You can't escape, Jacob.
My blood ran cold. Those words seeped into my ears, chilling me to the bone. I turned to leave, but something held my feet in place. I looked down and saw an old pair of shoes still attached to a ghostly figure. It was pale, translucent, its face twisted in pain. Its hollow eyes stared at me. Then, more appeared. Ghostly figures emerged from the darkness, their bodies flickering like dying candles. They reached out to me, their cold, damp hands, their voices filled with sorrow.
Help us. Save us.
I tried to back away, but the shadowy figures closed in on me. Their icy hands brushed against my skin, sending shivers down my spine. Desperate, I pushed them away, their cries echoing in my ears. I needed to escape now. At the back of the train, I found a locked door leading outside. I pounded on it, shouting, but it wouldn't budge. Then, in the corner of the car, I noticed a faint light. I knelt down and lifted a loose floorboard, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was an old, dust-covered journal. The journal belonged to the original train conductor. He described strange occurrences and ghosts. His final entry spoke of a curse, a train cursed to hold the souls of the dead on board, and there was only one way to break it, by confronting the source of the haunting and seeking out the mirror in the car to destroy it. Determined, I followed through to the back of the train. At the rear, I found a large, cracked mirror. Its surface shimmered with a strange energy. Looking into it, I saw the faces of trapped souls reflected in the glass, their eyes filled with sorrow. Its shape shifted and swirled. Terror engulfed me, but I couldn't let it win. I searched for something to break it, as if someone were hiding everything to stop me from doing this. I decided not to wait, reaching out with trembling hands, and punched the cold glass. The figure screamed a piercing scream as the mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces. The ghastly shadows around me began to fade, their faces peaceful as they were finally freed. The train also started to slow down. I staggered onto the platform, my heart still racing, my body aching from the ordeal. The town, now bathed in the gentle light of dawn, returned to its quiet state. As I looked back at the train, it was now just an old locomotive. The station master was waiting for me on the platform, a pleasant smile of relief understanding what I had accomplished as he left. I nodded, too exhausted to speak, but grateful to be alive. I had freed the trapped souls on the midnight train, and I knew I would never forget the terror I had faced. The midnight train had become legend, but the memory of that night would stay with me forever. Uber drivers, weird night. I had been driving Uber for about a year and had never really encountered any trouble, except for once when a drunk man tried to punch out my backseat window. But the only reason I quit this job has to do with something I had never encountered, and to this day, I still remember it vividly. Around midnight, I received a request to pick up someone named Pamela at an address that seemed a bit off the usual route. I drove to the address. The area was deserted, and there were no signs of anyone being around. Suddenly, the back door opened, and I jumped in surprise. Turning around, I saw an elderly woman, probably in her 80s. At this late hour, it was a bit odd, but I had seen older passengers before, though not very often. She silently struggled to get into the back seat, and I noticed her hollow, empty eyes, as if she had just woken up from a coma and couldn't make sense of what was happening around her. "How's your night, Pamela?" I asked cheerfully and friendly, but she didn't respond. A beep from my phone. A destination popped up. It was quite nearby, but I had never heard of it before, so I felt a little uneasy. I drove, trying to push that strange feeling out of my mind. The city blurred by in a haze, but then a voice, low and raspy, finally spoke. "Why aren't you taking me to that address?" she said to me. I told her I was taking her there, and it was still quite a distance. I replied, trying to stay polite. But the uneasy feeling, something wasn't right, kept growing. Then she started yelling at me, demanding I stop the car. It felt a bit rude, but what I needed to do now was stay polite. I wanted her out of my car, so I happily complied and stopped. I complied, stopping the car at a quiet corner just a few blocks away. I tilted my head to glance over my shoulder to wish her good luck, as it was part of my daily routine. But when I turned back, Pamela was right in front of my face, just millimeters away, hovering between the two front seats. I froze. Her eyes were white, sunken deep into her face. Her mouth was wide open, gasping for air, as if struggling and laboring to breathe. I stammered, "Pamela, are you okay?" Then her hand touched my shoulder. It was cold as ice, seeping into my skin and bones. Her pupils rolled back into her head, leaving her eyes completely white. My mind couldn't comprehend anything, and I began to fear for my own life. Before I could say anything, she leaned close to my ear and whispered in a chilling voice, "Go to the stairs tonight." I looked at her, confused. Pamela didn't say anything else, then climbed out of the car. I watched her shuffle toward a dilapidated building and disappear inside. I whispered to myself, not knowing what the hell had just happened. That night, I turned off the app and drove back to my apartment. When I arrived at the building, I sat in my car for about 10 to 15 minutes, trying to make sense of the woman's words. Eventually, I calmed down and went inside the apartment. I had just moved into this place because the rent was cheap, and it was an old building. People always complained about the maintenance and facilities. It really needed repairs, but the landlord never cared. I lived on the 6th floor. I went to the elevator and pressed the button, watching the numbers slowly go down. There was no one else in the lobby, but I couldn't shake the chill running down my spine. The numbers on the screen flickered. Suddenly, I heard a hoarse whisper, cold and close to my ear, "Close it." I jumped, looking around, but there was no one there. Pamela, is she following me? Sweat beaded on my forehead, and I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I sprinted toward the stairs, almost crawling on all fours as I climbed. The darkness below seemed to be chasing me. When I reached my apartment, I slammed the door shut and sat on the floor. Suddenly, I heard a loud crash. It sounded like something had collapsed to the ground, and the fire alarm went off, with people screaming. I opened the door and saw other tenants looking down the hallway, talking in panic. The elevator, It malfunctioned and crashed. The landlord was handcuffed and led away, charged with endangering tenants by neglecting maintenance. Other residents were shouting at him, angry at his irresponsibility. I stood still in disbelief that I was alive. As the police took the landlord away, I overheard two tenants talking, saying they remembered him once saying he had fixed it, but Mrs. Miller still died, crushed. They couldn't even imagine how terrified she must have felt when the elevator fell. "Who are you talking about?" I asked. One person answered, "That's Pamela Miller, the woman who lived in your apartment before you. She died in that very elevator, but somehow, the landlord got away with it. I still visit her grave sometimes. God bless her." My head spun as I tried to understand. I had just driven a woman named Pamela. I realized that the woman I had met wasn't just a strange passenger. I had encountered something beyond my understanding. Maybe she was trying to warn me so I wouldn't meet the same tragic fate as hers. Mysterious invitation in the basement. The warm afternoon sun spread across the school campus as the students left for the day. I remember it like it was yesterday. Everything seemed normal, but there was something different about that week. That was the week Justin arrived. He was a new student, showing up in the middle of the semester without warning. He was quiet, maybe a little strange, but friendly enough. He sat next to me in class because there happened to be an empty seat, and soon enough, we started talking. Justin always seemed distant, like he was hiding something and rarely talked about himself. He just said he had recently moved to our town. There was something odd about him, but I brushed it aside. I thought everyone had their quirks. A few weeks later, he invited me over to his house. I was a bit surprised by this. He told me to come around 7 p.m. I wasn't particularly excited, but I agreed. After all, he was new to town, and I thought he could use a friend. That night, I took a bus to his neighborhood and started walking to find Justin's house. His home was in a rundown area. The houses were small, and the streets were eerily quiet. The porch light was off when I arrived, and the windows were dark. I texted Justin to let him know I was there. After a minute with no reply, I moved closer to the front door. It was unlocked. I paused for a moment, then pushed the door open. Inside, it was almost pitch black. The house was silent, except for a faint noise coming from somewhere deep inside. I stood at the entrance, calling out for Justin, but there was no answer. My phone buzzed, and finally, he responded, "Come in. I'm in the basement." I went down the basement stairs. The sound of a TV or video game echoed from the basement. The basement door was slightly ajar, and the noise grew louder as I approached. I figured Justin was playing something. The basement was darker than the rest of the house, with just a faint light flickering. As I descended, the sounds of gunfire and explosions became clearer, but something felt wrong. I called out to Justin again, but the only answer I got was the echo of my own voice. At the bottom of the stairs, I hesitated. It was pitch black, except for the flicker of a TV somewhere in the distance. I moved forward, inching through the darkness, toward the faint light. I called out again, louder this time, "Justin," but still nothing. Suddenly, I felt it, a hard shove from behind. I stumbled and hit the ground face first. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and I lay there for a moment, stunned. Laughter echoed through the basement. I staggered to my feet, my heart racing. I turned, trying to see who had pushed me, but the darkness swallowed everything. Then came another shove, harder this time, sending me sprawling to the floor again. The laughter started up once more. It felt like I was being toyed with. Panic hit me. My legs were trembling. Someone kicked my legs as I tried to stand, knocking me down again. I had to get out now. I sprinted toward the stairs, my feet slipping on the slick concrete floor. My heart pounded in my chest. Footsteps echoed behind me, and the laughter still rang in my ears. My hands fumbled in the dark, desperately searching for the railing. My foot caught on the bottom step, and I stumbled, but I managed to catch myself. I burst through the front door and ran. When I got home, I texted Justin, wanting to know what the hell had just happened, but he never responded. The next day at school, I expected him to show up and either laugh it off or offer an explanation. But Justin didn't say a word. He sat there, silent, avoiding my gaze. Then, one Monday, he was gone. His desk was empty, with no books or belongings. There were rumors that he had moved away, but no one seemed to care. But I did. I couldn't stop thinking about that night. In my mind, I kept replaying the moment I was shoved and the laughter that followed me. It felt like I was being hunted. I still wondered if it had been Justin or someone else down there with me. And then I remembered something I had overlooked in the chaos. When I first entered the basement, there were more footsteps than just mine. I didn't dare go back to Justin's house after that day. I'm glad I escaped that house. I know that some mysteries are better left unsolved and without knowing, but the questions I wonder still haunt me and push me to find them. I don't know if I should. Mysterious invitation in the basement. It's been weeks since Justin disappeared. Despite my best efforts to move on, my mind kept going back to that basement. The laughter, the shoves, the darkness. No matter how hard I tried to push it away, it haunted me. There was a nagging feeling inside me I needed answers. Tonight, my phone rang. It was an unknown number, and a message was sent. It seemed like spam. Hey Ken, long time no see. Just remember to stay away from it. I didn't know what the warning was about, or what I was supposed to stay away from. But my mind kept repeating, could it be Justin? I couldn't keep living with this fear. If Justin had any answers, I was going to get them tonight. I grabbed my coat and headed for the door. Justin's house looked just as it had when I left it, dark and unsettling. The eerie silence of the neighborhood made me anxious. The front door was ajar, just like before. Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The house was quiet, and my footsteps echoed through the empty space, each step sending chills down my spine. The fear I had felt weeks ago crept back in. I cautiously headed straight for the basement. The door was wide open. The stairs creaked beneath me as I descended into the pitch-black void. I gripped my phone tightly, using its light to guide me, but the beam barely cut through the suffocating darkness. The temperature dropped as I moved deeper inside. Slowly, I saw it something I had missed before. In the faint glow of my phone, I noticed strange symbols carved into the walls, jagged and confusing like runes. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught my attention. I swept my phone around, and there, at the far end of the basement, I saw him, Justin. He stood still, his face pale, eyes wide, lifeless and empty, staring straight at me. My voice caught in my throat as I called his name. Justin? He didn't respond. He didn't move. Whether it was my eyes or the darkness, he seemed half visible, almost translucent in the dim light of my phone, like he wasn't even there. I cautiously moved closer, my heart pounding in my chest, and then the whispering began. It started small, unintelligible, but grew louder. Fear crept in. He was muttering something in a language I couldn't understand, then told me,
You shouldn't have come back.
Suddenly, my mind was flooded with images. I wasn't in the present anymore. I was seeing something from years ago. I saw Justin standing in the basement with his strange mother. They stood around a table covered with old books and candles. Justin seemed forced into it, his face filled with fear and resignation. The candles flickered, and suddenly, Justin froze. He stared at something in the shadows. A figure slowly emerged with eyes burning like fire. The figure reached out, and in a flash, everything stopped. I was back in the present, gasping for air. I stepped back, my eyes scanning the basement. Justin's body twitched, his mouth curling into a grotesque, twisted smile as he said,
It never left. It's been waiting for you.
I tried to move, but I couldn't. The ground beneath me trembled, and I felt invisible, icy hands pulling me down. But just as I was about to be swallowed by some unseen darkness, I saw Justin, his real face. It was different from before. He looked pitiful, as if he were trapped. He whispered faintly,
Help me, please.
In that moment, it hit me, had Justin never left the basement? Had he been trapped here all this time? I screamed his name, Justin, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. The last thing I heard was the basement door slamming shut above me, locking us inside. Then I opened my eyes. I woke up, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. I was in my bed, in my room, with the faint light of dawn creeping through the window. It felt like hours had passed, but when I glanced at the clock, only a few minutes had gone by. I had no idea when I had fallen, asleep. For a moment, I thought it was just a nightmare, but it felt too real. It made me think about the questions I had sought answers for, but that dream made me stop. Was it a warning to keep me away from all of it? I think I will never go back there again. The Stranger's Chase at Dunkin' Donut. It was just another regular shift at Dunkin', where I work part-time. The night shift is my usual shift, and tonight was no different. We usually close at 9 p.m., and I've grown used to the quiet that settles over the store as night falls. We had to clean up everything, and my coworker hadn't shown up yet. But that wasn't unusual. I was fine handling the store by myself. The inside of this Dunkin' was larger than most, with a few booths and tables scattered around. I had spent the last few hours in silence. No one had come in, and the last customer had left by 8:30 p.m. With only a few minutes left until closing, I walked around as usual, wiping down tables and making sure everything was tidy. As I passed by, heading back to the counter to clean up, something made my heart race. I hadn't noticed him before, but there was a man crouched down, almost hiding in the corner, completely out of sight from behind the counter. Everything seemed to freeze as his eyes locked with mine the moment I saw him. For a second, neither of us moved. The man slowly stood up. He was of average height, skinny, with messy hair and disheveled clothes. I asked him if he was okay, my voice trembling as I tried to stay calm. He didn't respond right away, mumbling that he was fine. I reminded him that we were closing and he needed to leave. He nodded and started walking toward the door. For a moment, I thought everything was fine, but then, without warning, he turned around and sprinted toward the counter with a crazed look on his face. Everything happened so fast. He didn't head for the door. He ran straight behind the counter, his eyes locked on the cash register. I began to realize what was happening. Without hesitation, I made for the exit, my mind racing. I didn't care about the cash register. I just needed to get out. Guys like him are dangerous, and they usually carry weapons. I had to be smart about this. But before I could reach the door, his voice rang out, loud and threatening. He shouted, his voice filled with anger. Stop. Froze for a second, but instinct kicked in, and I kept moving, my heart pounding in my chest. I pushed the door open and ran out, without looking back. I thought he would be inside to rob the store, but I was wrong. He chased after me, running through the parking lot, and fear gripped me like never before. I looked around the area, but most of the stores were dark and closed. I spotted a gas station in the distance, its lights flickering like a beacon of hope. I ran faster, my breath quickening, and he was still behind me. The distance between us seemed to shrink. I burst into the gas station, my chest heaving with each breath. It was the closest place still open. As I ran inside, I shouted for someone to call the police. My voice was panicked and full of fear, echoing through the empty space. The clerk behind the counter and a lone customer turned to look at me. Startled, I ran past them, heading straight for the back of the store. A small restroom sign caught my attention. My fingers fumbled with the lock as I rushed inside. The flickering light in the small restroom, combined with the smell of bleach, heightened my tension. I was shaking uncontrollably. Leaning against the door, I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I reached into my pocket, my hands trembling as I pulled out my phone and called the police. The dispatcher reassured me that officers were on their way, but the minutes felt like hours as I waited. I pressed my ear against the bathroom door, listening for any sign of him. Nothing. The silence was suffocating. Was he following me? Was he out there, lurking? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong and that whatever awaited me outside wasn't over. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly unlocked the bathroom door and peeked outside. The gas station was eerily silent. The cashier was no longer behind the counter, and the customer had disappeared. I cautiously stepped out further. The dim lights cast long shadows over the shelves. I walked carefully, my own footsteps suddenly too loud. My eyes darted to the door, but there was no sign of the man outside. For a brief moment, a wave of relief washed over me. Then I saw him. Through the glass window, his face appeared pale and terrifying. His wild eyes pressed against the glass like something from a nightmare. His eyes locked onto mine, a twisted smile spreading across his face. He smiled grotesquely, almost stretching from ear to ear. Then he breathed onto the glass, writing the word "run." It felt like a challenge, daring me to try escaping. He slowly dragged his finger down the window, the screeching sound sending chills down my spine. He was waiting, like a predator, knowing that eventually I would have to come out. Panic surged within me again. I rushed toward the back exit, hoping it would lead to some way out. As I pushed the door open, I found myself outside again, this time in the alley behind the station. My breath fogged the cold air as I frantically looked around for somewhere to hide. The alley was narrow, with tall brick walls on either side, dark and unwelcoming. A few trash bins lined the path, but it was mostly empty. I had to make a choice. The only way out was forward or back to the gas station, where he might be waiting for me. I didn't have time to think. I started running, my body moving on instinct. As I ran, I glanced over my shoulder, nothing behind me. Still, fear gripped me tightly. This alley too dark, too unknown, leaving me vulnerable to whatever could come. I turned the corner and was met with a dead end. My heart sank as I saw the towering chain link fence blocking my way. I could hear my own breath, ragged and loud, and feel the cold sweat on my skin. Maybe there was no way out. Footsteps echoed behind me. Slow. Maybe he was coming closer. My body froze in place as the sound grew louder, the rhythm unsettling in its calmness. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. My back pressed against the cold brick wall as I realized I had no other choice but to face him. He appeared at the end of the alley, his eyes locked onto mine with that twisted smile. His steps slowed as he moved into the faint light, his shadow stretching unnaturally across the ground. In his hand, he held an iron rod. My heart was pounding in my chest. My legs were shaking. Then he spoke. "You can't run forever." His voice was low, mocking. and dragged the iron bar across the road with screeching sounds. My mind seemed to be spinning. I scanned the alley, desperately searching for anything that could help me. Without thinking, I grabbed a broken brick lying near the trash cans. I knew it wasn't enough to stop him, but I had no other choice. It was all I had. He stopped just inches from me, smirking. "You really think that's going to stop me?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. As he took one more step toward me, I swung the brick with all my strength. In the moment, he was too focused on taunting me. Turning away smugly, I threw the brick, and it hit him square in the head. For a second, everything froze. He staggered back, the smile vanishing from his face as blood trickled down his forehead. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I seized the moment and ran. I didn't look back. All I could think about was getting as far away as possible. The sound of sirens tore through the night air in the distance. The police were coming, but I didn't stop running. Right then, the screech of tires cut through the air as police cars appeared. 3 patrol cars pulled into the gas station, red and blue lights flashing furiously. I could see the officers jump out, guns drawn, moving with urgency. I tried to shout, trembling as I pointed toward the alley. "He's over there." The officer nodded quickly and signaled to the others. They disappeared into the alley, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they shouted commands. The man appeared at the mouth of the alley, running toward the parking lot. But this time he wasn't alone. The police were right behind him. His wild eyes darted in every direction as he desperately searched for a way out, but he was surrounded. The police quickly tackled him to the ground. The man struggled violently, his voice twisted with rage, sending chills down my spine. But now, I was truly safe. The flashing lights of the police cars began to fade as I sat on the cold sidewalk, trying to piece together everything that had happened. It was over, but the horror still lingered. The outcome of the Hitchhiker Man. I was working the 3rd shift at a 24/7 diner in a quiet town. Most of our customers were truck drivers and travelers passing through. But the strangest people I've ever met were the drifters, addicts, and hitchhikers. That night started like any other. Carl, the cook, had been working at this place for over 15 years, and he had seen it all. His sharp eyes could spot trouble from a mile away. We were perfectly in sync. I served tables, and he flipped burgers. Oh, with a new cast in the pipeline, and he flipped burgers. Around 4 a.m., the shift was well underway. The place was completely silent, not a single person in sight. The only sound breaking the silence was the hum of the old refrigerator. Suddenly, the door creaked open. A man stumbled in, clutching his right arm to his chest. He didn't say a word, just shuffled past Carl and me, heading straight to the bathroom. His clothes were torn and filthy, and his face was twisted in pain. Carl and I exchanged glances. We'd seen strange customers before, but there was something off about this guy, more than just a regular drifter. I asked Carl, "Doesn't he look familiar?" After a moment, I remembered. That guy had come in before, begging for food and a ride. We had to kick him out because he was bothering the customers. But now, something had changed. He looked panicked, like he had seen something terrifying. Carl just shook his head, muttering, "Here we go again." I looked at the bathroom door. I didn't want to check on him, but I didn't have much choice. Carl handed me the keys, nodding toward the bathroom. "Go check if he's all right." I knocked on the door, asking if he needed help, but there was no response. I knocked again, harder this time. Still, nothing. I called out, fumbling with the keys. I pushed the door open, saying I was coming in. The bathroom was empty. No trace of the man. No dirt, no blood, nothing. The bathroom was as clean as the night before. I froze at the doorway. End and year and ye and Andra. I screamed for Carl. He rushed over. I backed away as he pushed past me, staring into the spotless room with wide, disbelieving eyes. We stood behind the counter, both of us trying to make sense of what had just happened. How could he have disappeared? I looked at Carl, but he had the same horrified expression as I did. Then I saw movement near the front window. The man was outside, staring at us. His face was worse than before, bloody, swollen, and his eyes were bleeding. But what froze me in place was how his right hand hung limply at his side, looking like it was about to snap off. His thumb was sticking straight up, unnaturally stiff, as if he was trying to hitch a ride. Before I could grab the phone to call 911, a loud noise echoed from the back of the diner. Carl and I rushed to the back. It was coming from the freezer. Someone was tearing into the food boxes. Carl grabbed a knife from the counter, and we slowly moved in. The man was inside, tearing open a box of frozen meatballs and pressing a pile of meat against his arm, like he was possessed. But his arm, it wasn't right. His hand was dangling, almost detached from his wrist. For a moment, everything went still. We locked eyes on him, witnessing something we couldn't believe. Then, at an unnatural speed, he bolted past us, kicked the kitchen door open, and ran outside. Carl and I stood there, too shocked to react. We had just witnessed the impossible. Carl hurried to the front, locked the diner doors, and turned off the lights, plunging the place into darkness. The only light now came from the neon sign outside, casting a dim red glow on the counter. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, my hands trembling. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. That man, if he was really injured, was moving with an unnatural speed and strength. And those eyes, it was like something else was controlling him. When I looked out the window, the parking lot was empty. There was no sign of the man. Carl stood with me, his face tense, his eyes scanning the darkness outside. I asked Carl what we should do now, and if we should call the police. Carl shook his head and said they wouldn't believe us, and there was no way to explain this. He reconsidered, slowly walking to the phone and picking up the receiver. But just as he dialed 911, the lights in the diner flickered. The hum of the refrigerator went silent, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, in the darkness, we heard a soft, slow tapping on the window. We bolted through the kitchen, with Carl leading the way. I glanced back just in time to see the glass shatter, and the man crawling through the window like a wild animal. Carl pushed open the back door, and we stumbled out into the alley behind the diner. Carl panted, glancing around. We need to get to the car. We sprinted down the alley, the man's footsteps echoing behind us. He was faster than I expected, his heavy breathing growing louder as he closed in on us. I could hear his raspy voice muttering something, words I couldn't quite make out. Carl reached the car, fumbling with the keys, urging me to get in quickly as the doors unlocked. I yanked the door open and jumped inside just as Carl started the engine. The headlights flicked on, illuminating the man standing at the end of the alley. Now he was covered in blood, his smile wider as he slowly raised his thumb again, rigid and grotesque, like a hitchhiker's signal. Tires screeched as Carl slammed on the gas, and the truck sped out of the alley and onto the road. I glanced into the rear-view mirror, my heart still racing. The man stood motionless at the edge of the diner, watching us disappear into the night. We didn't speak for the first few miles, both of us too stunned to process what had just happened. We drove in silence for the next hour, trying to put as much distance as possible between us and that place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. I eventually called the police to report the incident. To my surprise, they told us to head toward a location near the diner. They confirmed that a man matching that description had been reported. The man had been killed in a hit and run accident near the ramp, not far from the diner. As I got closer, I saw it. It was the same man. His body lay by the roadside, his clothes covered in dirt. But the eeriest part was his right hand, still holding that thumb up, just like before. According to the report, the man had survived the initial accident earlier that night and had been able to walk. His desperate search for help led him to our diner before he collapsed on the road. But there was more to the story. It turned out that this man had been involved in a series of violent incidents years earlier, hitchhiking across states and attacking those who picked him up. The police pieced together his history, a fugitive, infamous for attacking victims and vanishing into the night. The accident had broken his body, but it didn't kill him immediately. He had stumbled into the diner, seeking refuge, only to return to the streets, where he was eventually found dead. The police said he had been trying to use his injury to manipulate others. We were lucky to have escaped him. As I stood in the parking lot, staring at the diner, everything started to make sense. The man wasn't a ghost. He was real. Maybe he had finally paid the price in the same way he had hurt others on the road. That was where his twisted journey had come to an end. Intruder on Halloween. The clock ticks softly, its sound nearly drowned out by the eerie music playing on the TV. Colorful costumes and decorations adorn the walls, remnants of the Halloween festival. Tonight, like every year, I was going trick or treating with my best friend, Casey. Excitement filled the air as we stuffed our bags with candy, the weight of our haul increasing after each house we visited. The streets were filled with laughter and the sound of children running from house to house. As we walked, we noticed a man standing near a lamppost. He wore a mask and held a flickering lantern. His eyes seemed to follow us as we passed by, sending a chill down my spine. I glanced at Casey, and we quickened our pace. We continued our journey, laughing and screaming as we collected treats, but occasionally, I caught a glimpse of the masked man lingering just out of reach. It felt like he was watching us. At one house, while we were busy stuffing our bags, I turned around and saw him standing on the street, intently watching us. I yelled at Casey to get away, that we needed to run fast from there. We hurried to the front door of the house we were at and knocked frantically. The homeowner opened the door. We explained that there was a scary man outside. The couple looked worried and ushered us inside for safety as the masked man moved further down the street. After a few minutes, we saw the masked man had left, and we thought we could leave the house now. Just as we thought we had escaped, I spotted him hiding behind a tree, waving at us. Panic flooded me. He only backed away when an adult threatened to call the police. After walking a few more blocks, we crossed a small wooden bridge over the river. The night air was fresh and cool, but a sense of unease washed over me as a black Jeep stopped on the other side. The driver leaned out the window. A spooky man wearing a pumpkin mask called out to us in a gravelly voice. "We need directions," he shouted. I felt a bit suspicious and distrustful of this man, so I declined and we kept moving. The Jeep couldn't cross the bridge, so we had to drive away. But just when we thought we were safe, a long time later, an SUV screeched around the corner of the bridge and stopped right in front of us. The window rolled down, revealing a man who was probably someone else, but he was also wearing the same mask. Then he said, "Get in the car, and they have free bags of candy," the man shouted, his voice filled with manipulation. My heart raced as I glanced at Casey. We turned back to running when I heard the car roar again. The man started to get out of the car. We just ran as fast as we could to the house because we were almost home. We finally arrived home. My mother left for work, so it was just the two of us at home. Tonight, Casey slept at my house to stay safe. Every second passed as I looked out the window uneasily at that man in the pumpkin mask. The memory of the Jeep, everything was still in my mind. Mine. The streets were pitch black, darkness stretching over the sidewalk. I held my phone, staring at the screen, hoping to distract myself from the rising anxiety within. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. A message from Casey. What if they come back? I glanced at her, but she was still peacefully asleep, unaware of the tension suffocating the room. I cautiously approached the window and peered through the curtains. My heart skipped a beat. The black Jeep was parked outside my house. I whispered urgently, shaking Casey awake. Casey's eyes flew open in fear. We both sat up, listening intently. The engine roared, and I could see a shadow moving inside the Jeep. My pulse quickened, and I knew we had to act and come up with a plan. I whispered, "If he comes in, we have to trap that man." We gathered supplies, a heavy chair, some rope from my dad's toolbox, and my phone, so I could call for help if needed. We figured we could block the door if he came in, trapping him inside. Casey nodded, and we hurriedly propped the chair against the door, tying it tightly with the rope. We were ready and positioned behind the chair, preparing for anything that might happen. Through the glass, I saw the masked man standing by the front door, his shadow ominously stretching. My heart raced as he knocked, the sound echoing like thunder in the silence of the night. Suddenly, I saw the man step back, turn around and walk towards the Jeep. I watched in horror as another figure stepped out of the car, both wearing masks and dark clothes. My mind is racing now. There are two people. I whispered, fumbling for my phone. "Casey, we need to call the police." Fear gripped me, knowing our trap might only buy us a little time to escape safely. But before I could dial, I heard footsteps approaching the house. The doorknob rattled, and my heart raced. The masked man yelled something indistinct, and I felt panic rise. "They're trying to get in," I said, gripping Casey's arm tightly. I heard them banging on the door, trying to break it down. The chair held for now, but I knew it wouldn't last long. "Call the police," I shouted, but Casey was frozen in fear, her eyes wide. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. I whispered, "We need to run, and when they break in, Casey and I will head for the back door." With a loud crash, the chair toppled over. The door swung open. The masked man charged into the living room, followed by another figure. I slowly crawled toward the door, then grabbed Casey's hand, and we ran toward the back door, quietly escaping the intruders. We bolted out into the backyard and ran toward the fence. Behind us, I heard the men shouting. I shouted for Casey to climb over the fence. I thought we still had hope and needed to seize this chance to try to get over. As things grew urgent, I started to climb up, but unfortunately for me, one of them came outside and managed to grab and pull my leg. I flailed and kicked at his face, but it didn't seem to matter. It didn't faze him at all. I fell painfully to the ground. I looked in agony as Casey cried in fear by the fence on the other side. I screamed for her to run. I would follow, but she seemed too scared, worried for my safety. I lay in pain, watching him grin grotesquely. He taunted me, saying trick or treat, and waved at Casey playfully, enjoying our fear. I reassured myself that I needed to escape and survive. I slowly, secretly grabbed the ice and stood up to answer his question as if I was pretending to play with him. I took candy out of my pocket and said I wouldn't run away. I asked if he wanted a piece of candy. He seemed surprised and didn't notice as I threw the rock at his face. He fell, screaming in pain, and his friend came out from the house, witnessing it. He also yelled in anger. I didn't think much, trying to use the remaining strength to climb over the fence to escape. Just as we were about to escape, I heard the distant sound of a siren. I felt relieved. The police were coming. I headed toward the front yard to meet them. When we reached the front yard, the flashing lights of the police car lit up the street. The officers ran toward us, and I pointed at the men trying to flee back to the Jeep. "They're over there," I shouted, and the police sprang into action, chasing after them. Within minutes, the police had apprehended the masked men. Back inside the house, my mom rushed in, just returning home. She pulled us into a tight hug, relief evident on her face. Casey and I exchanged glances. We were finally safe. My mom made us a cup of hot cocoa, and as I took a sip, I couldn't help but reflect on how quickly everything had turned from a night of fear to a sense of safety. I said, glancing at Casey, "Maybe Halloween isn't so bad after all." The neighbor's dark secret. I often have insomnia, so I often choose to stand at the balcony door, looking out at the quiet neighborhood. I live in a really isolated neighborhood. The houses around here are not right next to each other, although I do have a neighbor who has a fence that I can see over if I stand on the balcony. I'm not being nosy or anything, but that night, I was looking into his yard. I've never met him because that neighbor just moved in, but I assume he lives alone because there's only one black truck parked in his yard. Today, I continued to go to the balcony and look at his yard. The truck had been missing for a week. I played the game of observing the truck at night and theorizing about its purpose, even though that was none of my business. Suddenly, one day, I saw him. My neighbor walked out of the house, dragging something. It looks like it's a long, black bag. It looked quite heavy, and it took him a lot of strength to pull it. On the ground, there is a leak of something that looks thick. He struggled to lift it, then pulled it toward the truck, sliding the side door open. He stuffed the bag into the trunk before driving away, then glanced around as if checking to make sure no one was watching. I stood there, my mind spinning. I couldn't ignore it anymore. So I called the police. They arrived quickly and checked around his property. I stayed, watching from the window as they spoke to him, but then his demeanor was completely different. He led the police to one of his bags, opened it, and inside was meat. He started pointing at his dog, which barked eagerly as he lifted it, filled with excitement. The screams, he claimed, were just him rehearsing a scene from his favorite TV show, and he did it every night. The police found nothing else. To protect my identity, the police came inside and spoke privately about me calling them. They warned me. They said if I continued calling without evidence, I could be charged with privacy violation and harassment. When they left, my neighbor came over, placing a hand on my shoulder. With a friendly smile, he said, "Let's not let little misunderstandings get out of hand, all right?" It felt like a warning. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe he really was just an odd guy, with strange habits. Every night, I hear faint, muffled, haunting screams. I tell myself it's just him rehearsing, as he said. Then one evening, he showed up at my door holding a cake. He told me it was his birthday and gave me the cake to clear up any unnecessary misunderstandings between us. Was he smiling? I wasn't sure if it was my mind playing tricks, but I felt like he was giving a sinister smile behind my back, waiting for something. As I closed the door, a wave of fear came over me. I took the cake into the kitchen. I placed the cake on the table, not daring to eat it, and just stared at it for a while. I considered eating it, dismissing my paranoia, and slowly brought it to my mouth. But then, something like an instinct told me not to. I put it down, reminding myself to stay alert. Thinking of him preparing it, watching me, knowing I'd eat it. It was truly horrifying. I grabbed the cake, took it to the trash bin behind the house, and threw it away. I didn't care if I was being unreasonable. I'd rather be safe than sorry. Early the next morning, when I went out to take out the trash behind the house, something caught my eye. There, beside the trash bin, was a small mouse, dead. Its tiny body lay still, right next to where I had thrown the cake the night before. A thin trail of cake crumbs led from the cake to the mouse. The mouse had eaten the cake and died. His depravity was beyond imagining. The cake was not a gift, it was a warning. From that moment, I started watching. Every sound, every strange occurrence, every word from my neighbor. Now I knew he wasn't just a harmless eccentric. He was hiding something dark. Everything started again when I walked past my neighbor's house. My steps slowed as I glanced at his front door, catching sight of a hand pressed against the glass, moving frantically. The glass was old and foggy. I saw someone inside, exhaling and writing help on the dust-covered window. For a second, I turned away, rushing back home. I didn't want to know what was happening behind that door. Back in bed, I couldn't sleep. The image of that pleading face, the desperate scrawl on the window, kept replaying in my mind. The sounds, the black bag, the screams. If I reported this to the police, I knew he'd find a way to cover it up, like he always did. Without evidence, everything would be pointless. I needed a clear and specific plan. I decided to reach out to my friend. I met my friend at the local cafe and explained everything, detailing the strange events and horrific scenes. He looked at me, skeptical, but didn't dismiss it right away. We had known each other for so long, neither of us wanted to believe this was happening. Then he suggested gathering photo and video evidence using advanced technology to avoid detection. I had to do whatever it took to prove my words. Neither of us could imagine what we were about to do next. But I promised him that we would only collect evidence and leave quickly and discreetly. The next morning, I put on a plumber's uniform and a fake mustache, mentally preparing for my decision. I approached my neighbor's door, disguised as a plumber. He opened it, eyeing me strangely, scrutinizing. He glanced at my house, then back at me, asking, "Nick, is that you?" I froze for a moment. I began faking my voice, using a different tone to deceive him, explaining I was sent to check and fix the city's main water pipes. At first, he seemed suspicious and told me to wait a moment before closing the door. I stood outside, not knowing what he was doing inside, waiting and adjusting my glasses. But eventually, he acted friendly and allowed me inside. As I entered, the house was much tidier than I had expected, and nothing suggested he was a murderer. As I pretended to inspect the pipes under his kitchen sink, he stayed close, following me throughout the house. My every move was under his watch. I hadn't anticipated this. His presence was a constant reminder that one wrong move could be my last. I racked my brain for a way to separate myself from him. Then, an idea struck. I asked him to let me check the pipes in the basement, explaining that I needed to inspect the pipes there, adding, "If you come with me, you'll need to be careful. A broken pipe could be very dangerous and make things worse." He hesitated, but finally, he allowed me to go down to the basement alone. I watched his shadow disappear into the darkness. I turned my attention to the house, moving quietly, looking through every corner, hoping to find something out of place. And then I saw it, an edge jutting out along a wall, as if something was being hidden. My fingers brushed along the edge, feeling the rough texture beneath my hand. With a gentle push, the panel creaked open, releasing a foul stench that made me nauseous. I hesitated. Well, would I pro? The smell was nearly unbearable, but curiosity overpowered my fear. I cautiously stepped closer, peering inside. There, in the dim light, I saw a long streak on the floor leading to black bundles that were oozing blood. Then I saw dozens of bodies, skeletal remains intertwined with decomposing corpses. Just as I was about to turn and escape, a cold hand gripped my shoulder. "Hello, my neighbor," a familiar voice whispered in my ear, full of malice. I felt the pressure of his grip tightening, but before I could react, he shoved me forward, standing in front of the door, blocking my only exit. His eyes showed satisfaction. I reached for my phone and pressed the emergency alarm button. Just as my friend and I had planned beforehand, he quickly snatched the phone from my hand. Then there was a crackling sound as he crushed it underfoot. I realized I was truly trapped. The police stormed into the house unexpectedly. My friend, true to his word, had taken action when he received my emergency signal. He had told me beforehand that he would alert a trusted officer in case anything happened. The neighbor began to flee, but during the pursuit, he couldn't escape our plan. He was caught and couldn't deny the overwhelming evidence. When I handed over all the footage and he was taken into custody, I lay in the hospital thinking about what I'd been through. I had come closer to death than I ever imagined. I regretted nothing. Reflection in the mirror. It was an August summer, the season where the days were long and the nights seemed endless. I was lying down watching TV, enjoying a relaxing day off. I have a friend named Leo. One day, Leo brought home something strange, a book titled How to See Spirits. He had stolen it from his grandmother. I felt uneasy, but at that age, curiosity often overpowers fear. That night, we decided to try one of the rituals in the book. The ritual was simple, just a candle and a mirror, and we had to perform it at 4 a.m. We met in front of an old apartment building. It seemed like the perfect place to summon something. We got into the elevator, holding the mirror and candle as instructed, and went up to the top floor. Once we reached the top, we lit the candle and held the mirror to the side, careful not to look directly into it. We stood in the dark, waiting, our eyes fixed on the faint reflection in the mirror. At exactly 4:44, Leo whispered, "There's nothing here," and for a moment, I thought he was right. But then, the candle went out. Darkness swallowed us. I fumbled for the elevator door, but when we got there, the lights inside flickered, and in the mirror, I thought I saw something. It was shaped like a demon with long hair. That figure stood right behind us, glaring with glowing red eyes, unblinking. Leo grabbed my arm, and we started running. We didn't stop until we were far away from the building, the first rays of dawn lighting up the road. Leo finally called his grandmother. When he told her what we had done, she was furious, warning us that what we saw wasn't just a regular ghost. It was something much more dangerous. If we weren't careful, we could lose our lives. There was a way to stop it. We had to perform another ritual, blindfold ourselves, and hold a mirror. We were not allowed to look at anything until the sun fully rose. That night, Leo and I stayed in the room, too scared to do anything but wait for dawn. The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. I couldn't sleep because of the fear, so I talked to Leo. As time passed, Leo grew quieter, mumbling, "Let's try taking off the blindfold." I told Leo to stop and remember the instructions, but then Leo's voice came from somewhere, saying he hadn't said anything, asking what I was talking about to myself. Then the whispers continued by my ear, telling me the sun had already risen to take off the blindfold. I was confused, unable to tell what was real. Could this be the demon's trap, set to make us break the rules? And then it happened. I heard the door creak, too afraid to look, but I could feel Leo moving. I told him to stop, not to open the door, but all I got in return was silence. I felt lost in my own darkness and fear. I didn't know what was happening. I closed my eyes, squeezed them shut as tight as I could, praying the sun would rise soon. I heard the door open, footsteps, then silence. It kept repeating, but I held on. Then, I didn't know when, but I must have fallen asleep. Through my blindfold, I could faintly see the glow of the sunlight. I quickly grabbed the mirror and smashed it on the floor, the sound of breaking glass shattering the morning silence. But something wasn't right. Leo was gone. I called out to him, but there was no answer, and I cautiously removed my blindfold to look around the room, but he wasn't there. Weeks later, my family had to move to a new place. I lost contact with Leo. From that day on, I couldn't find any trace of him. Some say he came back, still in that room, mumbling to himself, scratching at his eyes, saying he's waiting for someone to return. Now, every night, I sleep with an eye mask and earplugs. I can't look into mirrors at night. I don't know, maybe we're paying the price for what we did. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, when the world is quiet, through my earplugs, I can hear the faint whisper that tells me it's still waiting for me. When I walk home when I'm least alert, I always catch a glimpse of it in the corner of my eye, but just a shadow, a reflection, fleeting indistinctly. And I know one thing for sure: never summon something you can't send back, because the consequences will be unpredictable. The Haunting of the Abandoned Station. It was a chilly autumn evening in our small town. Inside the diner, warmth enveloped me. Sarah, my girlfriend, was finishing her cup of coffee. We had been dating for a few months, and tonight seemed like the perfect opportunity for an adventure since we both enjoyed that. After dinner, we decided to explore the old abandoned train station in town. The train station loomed before us. Built in the early 1900s, it had once been the heart of our town, but now it lay in ruins, overtaken by nature. My heart raced, but I didn't want to show fear in front of Sarah. I reassured her, even though I felt a hint of doubt creeping in. She began glancing around nervously and told me she felt something was off. Then, from afar, we heard a faint whistle echoing through the air. Sarah asked me, "There are no trains running here anymore, right?" I only knew that no trains had run here for decades. The whistle grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of wheels clattering on metal tracks. Sarah tightened her grip on my arm. "We need to go right now," she urged, panic rising in her voice. But somehow I lost control, as if mesmerized by the sound, stepping closer to the edge of the platform, staring down the empty tracks. The sound grew louder, yet no train was in sight, just the tracks stretching infinitely into the darkness. Then, as if summoned from nowhere, a blinding beam of light appeared, racing toward us. It approached quickly, gliding down the tracks like a ghost, but something was off. That light wasn't attached to any train. It hovered. Sarah screamed, urging me to stop, pulling me back just as the invisible train roared past. Its force nearly knocked us over, the platform shaking violently. For a moment, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, the station was silent again, the air heavy and still. Distant sounds returned, but something had changed. Sarah was gone. "Sarah," I called, panic rising within me. I searched for her frantically. Then I saw it, a shadowy figure standing on the tracks, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, its eyes glowing red like embers in the dark. A chill ran down my spine as it raised its hand, pointing down the tracks. Far down the tracks, I saw Sarah, walking away from me. But she wasn't walking normally. Her movements were stiff, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. "Sarah, stop," I yelled. But my voice echoed back, swallowed by the night. I ran toward her, desperation driving each of my steps. The closer I got, the more horrific reality became. Her face was blank, expressionless, her eyes vacant and soulless. It was as if her very soul had been drained. Tears streamed down my face as I reached for her, but the distance between us never closed. The shadowy figure at the station let out a raspy laugh, echoing through the trees, sending waves of fear crashing over me. I turned to face the figure, but it had vanished. In its place stood an old, rusted, decaying train, its windows shattered. Shadowy figures filled the cars, their hollow eyes staring at me. The door creaked open, like an invitation into the darkness. My heart raced with fear and curiosity. A whisper brushed my ear. "Join us. We've always been here waiting for you." I shook my head, backing away, but the pull of the train was too strong. My legs moved on their own, drawing me toward the door. Just as I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. The train swayed, and I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I turned to see Sarah sitting across from me, her eyes vacant. "What's happening?" I choked out, but she didn't respond. Instead, she slowly raised her hand and pointed out the window. I looked outside. I was standing on the platform, staring at the train. But how could this be? I was inside. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The train raced faster and faster, the outside world fading into a blur in whispers. Suddenly, it stopped, and the door creaked open. Then, that dark figure appeared inside the train, leaning in close, its cold breath chilling me to the bone. "You should never have come here," it whispered, and everything went dark. When I awoke, I was lying on the cold ground, the train and station gone. All that remained was an empty field overgrown with weeds, a stark contrast to the horror I had just endured. I stood up, dazed and disoriented, and headed back to town. As I neared the town square, something caught my eye, a missing person poster. It was Sarah's face, but the date was from 10 years ago. My heart sank as I stumbled back, trying to comprehend the horror. Had I really been gone for 10 years? Or had Sarah vanished long before I ever met her? The truth was too horrific to grasp. Desperate for answers, I rushed back to the station, but when I arrived, it was gone. Only an empty field remained. The train, the darkness, the station all vanished as if they had never existed. Memories flooded back the faces of victims, broken families, the whispers of those who had vanished without a trace. Each shadow symbolized a haunting reminder of what I had escaped, of the guilt I carried for failing to protect those who needed me most. I turned away and walked on, ready to embrace the memories instead of fleeing from them. The shadows may linger, but I would no longer let them control my life. The House of the Lost Child. It was 2006 when my family moved into this house. My parents decided to quit their jobs and start anew in the countryside. I was just a child then. But something about this house struck me immediately. The first thing I noticed when we moved in was the stairs. Every time I passed by, I would see a shadow silently moving up and down. It never frightened me. In fact, it felt oddly familiar. I was 6 years old, but I could always see things that others couldn't, and this house was no exception. I didn't tell my parents right away, not because I was scared, but because I felt that presence meant us no harm. Still, I was very afraid of the dark. My room was upstairs while the bathroom was downstairs. Every night, before going to bed, I would use the bathroom to avoid facing the fear of going down the stairs alone at night. But one night, my mother's voice woke me. She called out to me, angrily and irritably, telling me to come downstairs and not to run around anymore. I sat up in bed, confused. I hadn't run at all. In the following days, I kept experiencing similar incidents. My mother often scolded me for running around the house, accusing me of mischief. I had told her many times that I hadn't done it, but she never believed me. Then one night, the power went out, and we were almost engulfed in darkness, lit only by a few flickering candles in the living room. As we sat together, I saw it again, a shadow. It swayed back and forth, hovering over the sofa. My mother didn't see it, but I did. That presence was very strong but had no malice. That night, as we lay in bed, my mother and I heard a voice, soft yet clear as day. "Mom, where are you? I'm cold." That voice belonged to a child, and it came from just outside our bedroom. My mother looked at me, eyes wide with fear. As I grew older, I began to understand that the shadow wasn't there to harm us. It wasn't a ghost trying to scare us, but a lost child searching for something. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that spirit was looking for its mother. I had a friend who could sense things like I could, and they suggested that I tell the spirit to move on. So one quiet afternoon, I stood in the living room and said to the air, "I believe your mother loves you very much. You can move on. It's time to go to a happier place." The house felt different afterward. The shadow disappeared. The footsteps stopped. No more voices at night. I thought that the spirit had finally found peace, or perhaps it needed to validate something because it had been left here and unable to move on in this house. In 2018, my aunt, Tita, who had worked abroad, returned home to retire. One evening, we sat together in the living room, sharing stories. We talked about the strange occurrences that had taken place in the house over the years. I told her about that spirit, about how my mother had once mistaken it for me because it looked like a small child. I explained how I had ultimately helped it move on. As I was speaking, I noticed something. Tita, she's crying. She started telling me a story I had never heard before. Long before I was born, my grandmother, she was pregnant with Aunt Tita. Not long after that, there was a baby boy. She named her son Angelo. Suddenly one day, Grandma left and didn't come back. At that time, Aunt and Angelo were too young to know what to do in this remote suburb. So, Angelo lay on the sofa. The boy was sick and passed away in his sleep while clutching a small glass jar that his mother had given him. He was only about 3 to 4 years old. At that time, my aunt was too young to understand what was happening and thought her brother was just sleeping until one day a neighbor came and took the boy to a small coffin and buried him. Our new house sits on this land. Perhaps the boy could not move on because he was waiting and didn't know when his mother would return. Sometime later, my aunt, the boy's sister, passed away just after we talked about him. Now, standing in front of the house, I can't shake the feeling that something has changed. Then came the unmistakable sound of soft footsteps. They echoed from the hallway behind me, moving toward the stairs. I turned around, breath caught in my throat. The shadow had returned. As I climbed the stairs, I saw the shadow standing right above and sliding into my bedroom. Upon reaching the room, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and just as I was about to turn it, I heard, "Mom, where are you?" I slowly pushed the door open, the creaking hinges filling the silent house. The room was bathed in the faint light of the moon filtering through the window, casting a cold glow over everything. My heart skipped a beat as I saw Angelo. This time, he was not just a shadow. He stood in the middle of the room, a small, frail figure, unmistakably a child. His head was bowed down. Then slowly, Angelo lifted his head, and for the first time, I saw his face. A face with deep-set eyes filled with sorrow. His mouth opened, and in a voice that sent chills down my spine, he whispered, "Mom, where is she?" I wanted to tell him, to explain that she had passed away. But before I could say anything, he raised a small glass jar looking at it as if it held an ominous energy imprisoning his soul. Angelo stood still, clutching the jar, looking at me with hollow eyes. I had to do something. I couldn't let Angelo remain trapped forever. I took a deep breath, my voice trembling as I finally spoke to Angelo, telling him that his mother was no longer here. I told him to always believe that she loved him, so I urged him to move on. For a moment, Angelo's expression softened, but then he tightened his grip on the jar. His voice rang out again, firm and more desperate. "Where is my mom? I want to see her." As if he didn't believe the words I was saying, tears welled up in my eyes as I realized there were no words that could satisfy him. He wasn't just seeking peace. He wanted his mother, and nothing else mattered more than that. I could feel the air shift, the temperature drop, and for the first time in years, I felt fear. I couldn't let him stay. I had to help him find peace. Without thinking, I stepped toward him, my hands trembling. "Angelo, I can help you find her. But first, you need to let go, to release everything." His gaze shifted from the jar to me, his hollow eyes filled with confusion and longing. Slowly, very slowly, he began to loosen his grip on the jar. As it fell from his hand and shattered on the floor, the room went silent. Angelo's figure began to fade, dissolving into the moonlight. Before he disappeared completely, I heard his voice one last time, soft, almost a whisper. "Thank you." I stood outside the house. The weight that had burdened it for years was gone. Angelo was finally free. The feeling of guilt lingered, but I knew I had finally helped him find the peace he had been searching for all these years. The love his mother had for him, the love that had anchored Angelo to this world, had freed him. Perhaps he was beginning to understand the painful truths that even I never wanted to hear. He would likely continue his journey to find his mother in another world where he truly belonged. I looked back at the house one last time. It no longer felt haunted. Now, it was just a house, quiet and still. Angelo had gone, but he left behind something much more enduring. It was a son's love for his mother, transcending the boundaries of life and death. Stranger at the campsite. A woman, Lena, in her 20s, stood at the edge of the familiar trail leading to her campsite. Her hiking backpack was slung over her shoulders, and a neatly rolled up tent was strapped to it. She breathed in the fresh air, savoring the tranquility of nature. Lena had been camping here for years, escaping the monotony of her small town. The forest was her refuge. Lena moved forward, following the trail leading to the lake. The setting sun filtered through the trees. She felt at home here, but today, a strange unease crept into her chest. As Lena rounded the corner and arrived at the clearing by the lake, her heart skipped a beat. Standing near the water's edge was a man. He appeared to be in his 40s, wearing regular swim trunks and a faded white t-shirt. His small tent was already set up, not far from where hers would be. He was staring out across the lake, his back turned to her. Lena hesitated for a moment. She usually camped alone, and seeing someone else here made her feel uneasy. With a slight shrug, she moved a little further from his tent and began setting up her own. She gathered large stones, arranging them into a neat circle to prepare for her campfire later. As she was absorbed in her work, she noticed movement. The man was no longer facing the lake. He was staring directly at her, standing eerily still. Lena's heart raced. She tried to ignore him, focusing on her campfire. But every time she glanced up, he was still there, motionless, his eyes locked on her. Her discomfort grew. She awkwardly raised her hand and waved. Maybe he was just being polite. Maybe he wanted to say hello. But after a moment of silence, the man simply turned and walked along the shore without acknowledging her. Lena frowned. Something about him didn't feel right, but she shook off the thought. She grabbed a chair and sat by the shore, determined to relax and enjoy the view. Hours passed, and the sun began to set. Lena packed up her chair and returned to her campsite. She started a campfire, hoping to relax after the strange encounter. As she stared into the flames, her eyes drifted toward the tree line. A figure stood in the distance, partially hidden behind a tree. Lena squinted, trying to make sense of the shape. It was the man in the white shirt. He had returned, standing there, watching from a distance. Lena quickly shifted her chair to the other side of the fire so she could face him. Time passed slowly. The man stood frozen in place as the forest around them grew darker. The shadows deepened, and soon, his figure became blurry, blending into the trees. Even though it was dark, Lena knew he was still there. He could see her clearly, illuminated by the fire, but she could no longer see him. Fear gnawed at her. What was he doing? Why hadn't he returned to his tent? Hours passed, and Lena remained tense, staring into the trees. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and distant crickets. She considered leaving but feared the man might follow her, keeping her rooted in place. She stoked the fire, ensuring it burned brightly, knowing it was her only way to keep the surrounding darkness at bay. Lena sat by the campfire, her face blurred in the flickering firelight. The night was already thick with shadows. The forest around her was a pitch-black void. Her eyes continuously turned to the tree line where the man stood. Even though she could no longer see him, she knew he was still out there, following, waiting. Suddenly, a tree branch broke nearby. Lena stiffened, her breath caught in her throat. She looked around her camp, squinting into the darkness. Perhaps he has already arrived. The flames cast long, flickering shadows. Lena couldn't stop imagining shapes moving among the trees. There, at the edge of the tree line, someone was probably standing there because she always heard footsteps crunching through the forest. Then slowly, the man's silhouette appeared. She regained her determination, suddenly stood up, picked up a thick branch from the fire, and held it as a weapon. The man didn't flinch. He remained still, watching her as if waiting for her next move. Lena shouted into the darkness, her voice trembling but firm, asking who he was and what he wanted from her, but there was no response. The man tilted his head slightly, as if confused by her defiance. Lena's skin prickled with fear. She gripped the burning branch tightly and stepped closer to the edge of the campfire, ready to defend herself. But then, without warning, the man turned and walked into the forest. Slowly, cautiously. His footsteps were eerily soft. Lena watched him go, not daring to follow. He disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the trees, but the tension in the air didn't lessen. She didn't believe he was truly gone. The night dragged on. Lena struggled to stay alert, her body heavy with exhaustion, her mind clouded with fear. The fire had burned down, casting only a faint light. Despite her best efforts, her eyes began to droop. She couldn't fight it any longer. After only a short while, Lena was startled awake by a faint sound, her eyes snapping open. The fire was nearly out. Only a few embers remained. The air was cold and damp. For a moment, she was disoriented, unsure if she had imagined the sound. But then she heard the faint rustling sound again, this time coming from behind the tent. Lena's heart raced. She stood up slowly, creeping carefully to avoid making any noise. She grabbed a nearly burnt-out branch from the fire, gripping it tightly. She cautiously walked around the tent, following the sound. The rustling grew louder as she approached the back of the tent. Lena tightened her grip on the branch. She took a deep breath and rounded the tent, only to find a squirrel nibbling away. The area behind the tent was empty. Lena frowned, confused. She could have sworn she heard something like footsteps. She returned to the fire, scanning the surroundings. The first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. Lena's body was stiff from sitting for hours, her eyes heavy from the sleepless night. It seemed like she was very lucky. For some reason, the man never returned, and she saw no sign of him for hours. But the insecurity is still there. Lena quickly packed her things, wasting no time. She glanced nervously at the tree line. The forest remained quiet and still, as if the events of the previous night had never happened, and she wished that were true. She slung her backpack over her shoulders and began walking briskly toward her car. Her legs trembled. Every rustling leaf or snapping twig made her jump, but the trail remained empty. As Lena neared the parking lot, she began to feel a sense of relief. She could see her car up ahead, the only vehicle in sight. She quickened her pace, eager to leave the forest and the strange man behind. But as she reached the clearing, she froze in her tracks. His tent was still there. She slowly, cautiously, walked toward it. The tent flap was slightly open, the inside dark, but there was nothing there. Lena backed away, her mind racing. What kind of game was this? Was he even real? She snapped out of it and hurried toward her car. She slammed the door shut, her hands trembling as she started the engine, and drove off. As Lena sped down the winding road, she glanced into her rearview mirror. Standing at the edge of the forest, partially hidden by the trees, was the man in the white shirt. His hand was raised, thumb out, as if hitchhiking. Lena pressed the gas pedal harder, her car speeding away, and she never looked back or returned to that forest again. It left her with an unforgettable memory, perhaps the worst camping trip she'd ever had. Nightmare House on the Hillside. I was 6 or 7 years old when my parents divorced. My younger sister had just been born. My mother and stepfather decided to move into a new house, thinking it would be a fresh start for all of us, but it didn't turn out that way. It was an old house in the suburbs, built in the mid-1800s. It had 2 stories and a basement below. Down there was a door that led to water tanks used to heat the house, locked tight, with only my mom and the landlord having the key. We were warned not to go near it. I didn't understand why, but my room was always colder than the other rooms, even though it was right above the basement. I often heard strange creaking sounds, like someone walking on the floorboards. The house was quite old, and I would often see wasps coming from the attic. They swarmed as if drawn to something. I wasn't the only one who experienced strange things. My mom and stepfather often heard footsteps in the living room late at night, pacing back and forth, never stopping. But they brushed it off and said it was nothing. One night, I woke up with a strange feeling, like someone was in the room with me. I turned over and saw a boy, his face obscured by shadows, wearing old-fashioned clothes, about my age, standing near my desk. I sat up in bed. He asked me if I wanted to play with his toys. I told him no, it was too late, and I didn't want to get in trouble with my parents. Then his expression changed, becoming angry. In the blink of an eye, he vanished from my cold room. I ran to tell my mom, but she reassured me it was just a dream. Still, I knew she didn't believe it either. I began to feel something was wrong with this house. The next night, it happened again. But this time, it was someone else, a woman in a black dress. She was standing on my bed. She stood hunched over, her tangled hair hanging down over my face. She stared at me with deep, hollow eyes that were completely black, her breath chilling as it hit my face. I jumped up, flung open the door, and ran to my sister's room. She was still asleep in her crib. I looked back at the door and saw the woman slowly walking toward me. As she passed the window, lightning struck outside, and in that moment, The woman disappeared. With each flash of lightning, she would reappear, getting closer to me. I woke up again, back in my bed, drenched in sweat. My heart raced as I tried to piece together what had happened. Was it a dream? But it felt too real. I ran to my mom and stepfather, telling them everything. Their faces went pale as I spoke, but they told me it was just a nightmare. It was a lie they had been telling me ever since we moved into that house. A few days later, we moved out. My mother didn't say why, but I could tell by the way she hurried us out of the house that something had scared her too. It wasn't until many years later that she told me. The landlord eventually confessed what had happened in the house long ago. During the Civil War, a widowed mother and her 3 children lived there. After her husband was killed in battle, the woman's mind shattered. You ever or roll? In a fit of madness, she killed the rest of her family in the living room before dragging their bodies down to the water tank room in the basement. These things explained what I had experienced in that house, from the moved items to my toys being displaced. The boy I saw was one of her children, still trapped in the house, either searching for companionship or perhaps seeking revenge. And the woman, the one who stood over my bed, was the mother, her spirit twisted by the horrors she had endured. I often wonder what would have happened if we had stayed in that house. Would we have become part of their story? Would that woman have done to us what she had done to her own children? I will never know. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still think about that house on the hill and the dark secrets it held.